What's up, everybody? Welcome to my channel, Metaphysics Mike. If you're new here, tonight we're going to be doing something that, I don't usually do, and that's a debate review. I have a few on my channel, but I'm beginning to enjoy checking out some of these other debates in the space. My channel right now is laser focused on the Trinity, and some of these discussions are really good and worth checking out. And I want to look at the debate between Dan McClellan and Joshua Sijuwade. Have you seen this? Have you seen this debate yet? I've heard a bunch of hype around it. And now I'm assuming you know who these characters are. Probably you've heard of Dan McClellan. I just Googled their names, see what it writes about them. Dan McClellan is an American Bible scholar and public educator known for combating misinformation about the Bible on social media using data over dogma approach. He's got a PhD in theology and religion. He's all over TikTok, YouTube. Surely you know this guy, right? If some of you have been following me for a few years, back when my channel name used to be McClellan Media, Dan's actually responded to two of my videos, and oh yeah, he got me on one. It was actually pretty sad. I learned something from Dan McClellan. I also bought his book. Now, I haven't read this yet because I'm busy still going through the Systematic Theology book by Dustin Smith. And I like to take my time with books, but I have watched a lot of his content. So I agree with Dan on a lot, to be honest. I really like his way of thinking. I don't agree on everything. I think he's got some pretty hard takes in other areas. However, you really do got to pay credit where it's due. Now, this discussion is with Joshua Sijuwade. Do you know this guy? This is on Academia. This is what it said about him. He is a teaching fellow at the University of Birmingham, UK. His general research interests fall into the areas of philosophy of religion, analytic theology, and metaphysics. He's the author of a number of articles and has published the following monographs. A lot of these. I actually haven't read any of these papers. What was the one? He talked about this paper on, I think it was Inspiring Philosophy's channel. He's been in quite a few debates recently. A lot of people have brought him on to just talk about the Trinity. He's got a fairly influential voice, and it's my understanding he just converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. I believe that is true. What's up? I see you guys. My new handle says no, I have not seen it. Well, we're gonna check it out tonight. I'm pretty stoked to get into it. OG says if you have motion sickness, try not to focus on Dr. Sijuwade's screen as he's riding a horse, basically. Okay, we'll figure that out. Do Welcome says no, not yet. He says, isn't Dan an atheist? So, no, I don't think he is. Dan, I think, lands in the Mormon camp, I believe, doesn't he? I think he's a Latter-day Saint. There was only one video I saw where I thought he kind of made that clear. Vaughn says, I need to show you something, man. Well, I'm not sure how you plan to do that, but Eli says Dan is a goof. I'm not going to deny that he has some questionable takes in areas. And I mean, I know that's broad. We could get specific. I tend to agree with him, though, when it comes to the Trinity and his input. You can really learn a lot from it. You know what when I was looking up these guys, I thought, man, I wonder what Google says about me. So I looked it up. Thought this was so funny. It says Metaphysics Mike is a prominent Christian YouTuber, debater, and podcaster known for his work in biblical Unitarianism and pronomian theology. Not too bad. I was expecting quite worse. But man, I have heard that this debate was a lot of high-hanging fruit here. It was a good discussion. There was no, banter, no rhetoric. And that's good. You need conversations like that. It's usually those where people can best learn, me included. There's time to get aggressive, to try and hold people's feet to the fire, right? A view really does have to withstand scrutiny. It's a great way to discern truth from falsity, to see views get challenged. You know what I'm saying? So don't get me wrong. Debates are good. It's good to be rough at times. But I heard it wasn't like that in this, and that it was good. So I'm pumped to check that out. I don't really know anything about this guy, though, who held it, Glenn Shrivener. Do any of you guys know him? Have you watched any of his videos? I think I saw some things Dan did in response to him. But I don't know much about him. We'll have to see. Ema says Dan is really good in regards to textual criticism. You can see he doesn't involve his LDS beliefs into the Bible and scholarship, so you got to give it to him. There are some areas where I think the line's a little blurry there, but generally speaking, yeah, he's pretty solid on a lot. Diggs says the Trinity is nothing more than a big ad hoc. In many ways, I would agree. So let's go ahead. Let's dive into this, and I'm excited. I hope this is everything that I've heard it is, because I've seen nothing of it. This is raw.
And fundamentally, the Trinity is an attempt to construct a philosophically defensible framework that allows us to solve an algebra problem that we find in the Bible.
This wasn't an algebra problem. It's an algebra problem if you state the Trinity in the way that you stated it, but which I believe is erroneous.
Okay. Back in February, Dr. Dan McClellan said this: the problem is with the Trinity itself and the folks who are trying to enforce it. And the fit for this video has been data over dogma. I reached out on Twitter to say
Dan
let's
in
get into
his
a
shirts.
conversation. I also offered, why don't you talk to Dr. Josh Sijuwade? Dan didn't have the time for that, so I made an hour and 10-minute video that said this. In this video, I'm going to show how Dr. Dan McClellan gets the Trinity so badly wrong. The Trinity is not a maths problem. It is the good news that God is love and you're invited. Dan characterized...
What? Wait, what was that? The Trinity is the gospel? The message of love that you're included? Let's hear that one more time.
Maths problem. It is the good news that God is love and you're invited.
It is the good news. Okay, so we're just conflating the Trinity with the whole gospel now, are we? All right, not a good sign.
And characterized my video like this.
I'm sure it set off the tuning fork in the loins of the dogmatism of plenty of people in Glenn's audience.
To which I said, to be fair, if you've never set off a tuning fork in the loins of the dogmatism of people, you just don't know what you're missing. I see all things through the lens of Jesus because we all have dogmas, and it's good to declare them. But now the conversation that was promised in February is coming to pass. I've got Dr. Josh Sijuwade in conversation with Dr. Dan McClellan. Essentially, Dan's claim has been that
I guess this is the backstory of how this debate came to be, is what he's doing right now.
modern discomfort with the Trinity goes all the way back to the beginning. If you don't find the Trinity logically possible today, that's because it was never logically coherent, and it was only held in place through imperial power. Dr. Josh Sijuwade says, no, the problem is with us moderns, not with those ancient people. And here's a little taste of what is to come.
You were attacking an understanding of the Trinity, which isn't the correct understanding. The history that you've stated is just incorrect.
No, you wouldn't accept that. Okay.
No, I wouldn't accept that at all.
But by the end, there's a certain amount of unity.
You're a very nice individual, Dan, so it's lovely having you as a
In person, I'm a lot nicer than when I'm recording a video.
No.
Who would have thought we would come to such a moment of harmony? The three have become one, ladies and gentlemen. And that is all to come. But I start off by asking Dr. Dan McClellan why the doctrine of the Trinity has been such a source of fascination for him.
Well,
Okay, so listen, right off the jump, guys, that little clip that he put of Joshua saying, oh, you just don't, how did he say, how you've characterized it like isn't accurate. Oh, that's not a good sign to me that he's going to have a strong argument. I mean, that's when people have good data, they're going to hit you with really strong data. I would rather see that, right? Give me a little clip of the data, right, that he's allegedly going to school Dan with. That's just rhetoric to me. You just don't get it. You're conflating nature with person, right? Or they put off this facade like all Trinitarians have just magically agreed with each other since the beginning of time. Right? That's not a real narrative. No, Trinitarianism has not been this consistent doctrine ever. I mean, there were so many little bits and pieces of the puzzle that had to be put together first before they could even argue about what the Trinity is, what they mean by these words. Well, we might get into some of that, but hit me with a little bit of data. You know what I'm saying? Don't hit me with a little bit of rhetoric. All right.
Ever since I started in my kind of trajectory towards becoming a Bible scholar, some of the most interesting issues for me have been conceptualizations of deity. I joined the LDS Church when I was 20 years old. I spent 2 years in South America as a proselytizing missionary.
Oh, there it is. Join the LDS Church. Here's another one. That would make 2 videos that I've seen him talk about that. Maybe there's probably more, but I usually don't hear him mention really his like personal beliefs.
I fell in love with reading the Bible, and particularly the Gospels. I found out that I could make a living studying the Bible if I went and got a bunch of degrees in a row, and I thought that would be about the coolest thing in the world. And the topics that interested me the most were related to the conceptualization of deity and of Scripture, and particularly because I found it so interesting that Latter-day Saint concepts of deity were so much different from so many other traditions. And
I've been realizing that lately with my discussion with Jacob Hansen just a few days ago. Very interesting perspectives that I haven't heard anybody have. They actually sort of reject that like angels, God, and humans are different kinds of persons. They believe that they all are the same kind or genus. That's a pretty fundamental difference. He's not lying right there. I just experienced that.
So I was just interested in why there were these distinctions. And I went away to, I did a master's degree at Oxford. I wrote my thesis there on anti-anthropomorphism and the Septuagint, textual criticism of the Septuagint. And I then went to Canada, Trinity Western University, worked with Marty Abegg and Peter Flynn on Dead Sea Scrolls stuff. But there I did cognitive linguistics and the conceptualization of deity in the Hebrew Bible. I started off wanting to write about the threshold of monotheism in the Bible. I wanted to find out, when do we go from not monotheism to monotheism? And as I dug into it, I realized
that's a great question. What a phenomenal thing to look into, right?
I couldn't really get past the question of what a God is, because I was not satisfied with the scholarship that was out there, and I was learning cognitive linguistics. And so I thought, I think this is a good methodological lens for trying to understand how the authors of the Bible might have thought about the concept of a deity. And so that was my thesis there. I did my doctoral dissertation through the University of Exeter on cognitive science of religion and cognitive linguistics, conceptualizations of deity and divine agency. And so it's just been the way people think about what a God is and how gods relate to each other and to humanity has always been of the most interest to me. But very early on, I got disabused of the notion that I was going to have a successful academic career if I spent all my time trying to defend Mormon ideologies. And so I committed as an undergrad really to doing my best to try to engage things from a strictly academic point of view, divesting myself of concern for defending the dogmas of my particular faith. And that has made me a pariah both within and outside the LDS Church in a lot of ways.
Mr. Tyree, he says, Dan pretty early admits he is not speaking of Josh's model of the Trinity. Yeah, well, that's not really saying anything to me, though, because I'm not going to tell you that the conciliar model of the Trinity is what they were teaching 2,000 years ago. Please. I mean, his whole model is really based off this lateral move between all the councils and creeds. But quite anachronistic. You know, you can sort of define it however you want. Like, it's interesting. Him and I actually agree on some things. One of the reasons Joshua Sijuwade stuck out to me was that he openly, more than many, is like Jesus is God by predication. He's Yahweh by predication, right? Only the Father is God by his identity. And I mean, the boldness by which he has taught that, I've appreciated, because his view acknowledges a problem and presents a solution to where many other Trinitarians don't even acknowledge that's a thing. They don't even quite understand why those distinctions are relevant. However, that creates a huge problem. I mean, if only the Father is God by his identity, then he is God in a sense in which the others are not. And how do you ground such a difference in anything but their ontology? So, I mean, great, you solved one problem and created a new one. What Dan just gave us there, that was cool. Some personal information about how his view developed, transitioned, not wanting to defend the certain dogmas of the LDS and how that just led him into what he does now. It's cool. It's cool to hear about him.
So I spend a lot of my time trying to advocate for strictly academic approaches to understanding this, which, as I'm sure you can understand, does not make me particularly popular among a lot of believing communities. But it puts food on the table for me, so it gets the job done.
There's a very interesting episode to be done here, just about the psychology of Dr. Dan McClellan and why it is that you're able to stand forthrightly in the position that you're in. I'd love to do that episode. We'll have to do that another day. We'll do theology today.
A lot of people would love to see that
on the psychologist's couch, but yeah. So that situates you and your interest in this subject. Let's go to you, Dr. Josh Sijuwade. You teach philosophy of religion, but I think probably theology proper and doctrine of God seems to be where you focus. Is that true? And if so, why is that your special focus of interest?
Yeah, so, my actual main research area is philosophy of religion. And so philosophy of religion can be defined as an investigation of the meaning and justification of a religious claim using the best tools of analytic philosophy. So you look at a religious claim and you try and ask two questions of it. Can we clarify it? What is it?
I get what you're saying, that he was basically on a horse the whole time. You see him popping up and down, bobbing, you look at it.
And the second one, can we justify it? Why should we hold to it? And the way in which we approach those two questions or those two issues is by using the tools of analytic philosophy. So that would be drawing from areas of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And so that is my area. And I've looked at various religious claims throughout my research.
You know those, right? So epistemology, that's like real fundamental theories of knowledge, right? How do you know what you know? Epistemology, right? That's where we talk about like, epistemological frameworks for like morality or the justice system. Where do these things? That's it. Epistemology is big. We gotta love it. And ethics, that's another big one. They're all sort of interrelated, but that has to do with metaphysics.
And so one area is actually on the Trinity and the doctrine of God and incarnation. But I do have another area which I write on. And so, for example, I've got a book coming out within the next month or 2 months or so on the problem of evil. So that would be, why should we believe in God in light of the existence of evil? So that would still fall under philosophy of religion. So what I do as a philosopher of religion sort of requires you to go into theology, but I approach the theological questions as a philosopher, as someone who is trying to utilize my understanding of analytic theology to fulfill those two goals of understanding the meaning and also the justification of that specific claim. And so when you're doing that related to Christianity or theology, it might be, what does it mean for there to be a God? What does that mean for the Trinity to be the way that it's stated? Do we have any justification for that? And so, not to plug more books, but I've got another book coming out on the Trinity, so the coherence and truth of the Trinity, where I'm doing just that. I'm saying, does it make sense, the Trinity?
Dude, let me tell you, you want to make it big on social media, just make an argument for the Trinity. Right? Like, that's what you're a struggling Christian YouTuber, make a video about the Trinity. That's it. Like, I have 3 books coming out about the Trinity. Well, that's actually not even accurate. His first one was about the problem of evil. And hey, by the way, I don't discredit everything that these guys do or say or teach just because they happen to be Trinitarian. But that is sort of funny to me, though, right? Like, that's the reality. That's how you make a name for yourself. That's the quickest way to get a viral video on your channel. Make a video defending the Trinity and try and make it original as possible. You're in.
And we understand its meaning and what are the good reasons to believe in it. So that still falls under the wider, broad approach of philosophy of religion. Some people call, when you are looking at specific theological claims, they might call it analytic theology or philosophical theology. But generally, that still falls under the the purview or the range of research of the philosophy of religion.
Very good. Well, we're going to use all your analytic tools right now as we have a look at a short that Dan made back in February called Why the Trinity Doesn't Make Sense. And it's just about 90 seconds long. Should we play it? And then I'll ask Dan some questions, and then we'll get the conversation going.
Have you ever wondered why there are no adequate analogies for the Trinity? Or been left unsatisfied by attempts to explain that away as just one of the mysteries we have to accept? If so, the problem is not with you. The problem is precisely with the Trinity and those trying to enforce it. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. And fundamentally, the Trinity is an attempt to construct a philosophically defensible framework that allows us to solve an algebra problem that we find in the Bible. And the fundamental problem is, how is it that Jesus can both not be God?
Oops, my bad. I was muted. Sorry, guys. I see you. Oh, no. Oh, no. I'm such a rookie. Look at you all. Fix your mic. Mike, you're muted. My bad. My bad. Okay. So, listen. What I was saying is that's the whole basis for this debate right there. Did you catch it? About, is the Trinity a math problem? And all the study I have done, some of the most famous patristic scholars, I don't know how Dan could be wrong here. Listen to this.
And also simultaneously be God. And there are two reasons that when we tried to construct this philosophically defensible framework, we ran into internal contradictions that we just couldn't resolve. No matter how far down we dug, once we hit bedrock, there was stuff left over. There were questions that were raised by the process that could not be resolved. The first is that we approached the Bible with the presupposition of univocality, that it all...
Okay, but before we get to his comment about univocality, just what he said there. Listen, the councils, the creeds, all the commentary by Greek philosophers we call the church fathers are literally the evidence of what he just said. They are the evidence, right? They were constantly responding to disputes that prior generations could not resolve. They had to formulate doctrine more specific than before. And at times, they were even condemning bishops who were once highly respected for holding their positions. Tertullian. Origen, right? Both these men, foundational, just heretics in the Orthodox model. I don't think they're all heretics to the same degree, but I mean, what he just said, how could it be wrong? No, wow.
all had to be speaking with one single unified and consistent voice and from one single unified and consistent perspective. And so the authors had to be made to be agreeing with each other. They could not be representing different perspectives on the nature and the relationship of God and Jesus. The second problem was that the tools we brought to the issue were the canonical philosophical frameworks of the day, and they were inadequate to resolve an issue that arose as a result of intuitions about deity, about agency, about personhood. Intuitions that we wouldn't be able to adequately interrogate for over 1,000 years. But
yes, folks. I mean, must I provide just a very simple proof to this? Very, very simple. Watch, this will take me just a minute. Here we go. Desktop. I'm looking for my folder. When you look at the history of this, even just like a menial dabble in, you're going to find out that's the truth. Okay, here, look at this timeline. Do you see this on screen? Okay, let's just take this one. The Dionysius controversy. Do you know what this is? Okay, so you have the Pope at the time, whose name is Dionysius. And then you have an Eastern bishop who's also named Dionysius. And he writes some type of letter, some type of, I can't remember specifically what the name of it was, but he uses like this term like three hypostases. But there is this disconnect between the East and Western church, because the Western church is like mainly speaking Latin, and the Eastern church is mainly speaking Greek. And so the term hypostasis in Greek really translates more to like substantia in Latin. And so they perceived that statement as three gods. It was a big controversy. Now, if I remember correctly, the Pope doesn't like explicitly call Dionysius out by name, but everybody thinks that that's who he was talking about. And I mean, this is just one example where you have literally the Pope with other bishops having these disagreements. They're calling each other heretics because they don't have it quite figured out. The language isn't settled. I mean, even at Nicaea, right? You guys have heard me talk about this. Nicaea, the words like hypostasis and ousia were still used as synonyms, right? Please tell me, have you been watching my recent debates? I talk about this a lot. What's you know what? I should have some quotes right here. If you follow my channel, certainly you have seen these before. Boom, right? RPC Hansen. Hypostasis and ousia were originally synonyms, right? They could be used for either side of the equation. J and D Kelly saying the same thing, right? So that's just one example. Though I'll get all this off. We'll go back to watching, but this continued. I mean, on till like a ton of work by later Eastern theologians. They were still like hashing this out. You had the old Nicenes causing issues over what some of them wanted to use, personae for person. How dare you? What? It was a big deal. It was a big deal. So like, I feel like many Trinitarians they just kind of close their eyes to this. They're just like, I don't see it. I don't know what's going on. How is what Dan is saying wrong here? How? This just seems like what anybody should think. I mean, no matter what your view is.
We couldn't just scrap it and start over with a new approach because we had imperial and institutional leaders breathing down our necks. So we had an emperor come flying in off the top rope to smash that subscribe button once we had some kind of answer. And he said, sign on the dotted line or you're going to be exiled. It was imperial and institutional power that enforced a fundamentally inadequate explanation for what was going on in the Bible. And ever since, it has been institutional power that has been there to enforce the Trinity and say, this is what we believe, and you just have to accept it. The problem is not with those who say, this doesn't make sense to me, or who say, there's no adequate analogy. This is internally contradictory. The problem is with the Trinity itself and the folks who are trying to enforce it. And the fit for this video has been data over dogma.
I mean, okay, one more quick comment. I mean, just like consider, like, do you ever think about why Paul's letter to the Roman is his longest one? Just an interesting fact. Why? Did you know that the largest ancient church would start in Rome? Why? It's because they had most of the people. Most of the people were in Rome, right? It was like one of the largest ancient cities of the world at the time. And so, of course, Christianity is going to grow there more because that's where most of the people are. And so, like, what I'm trying to do is give you a sort of a cultural backdrop to what he just said there, because consider Christianity is rising in Rome where all the people are against the backdrop of all their other religions and gods and conceptions of God, what God is. And so what he just very in short described was that, I mean, there, of course, is going to be an influence of the culture on the religion. It's really that simple. And so they're trying to make sense of it, right? How do they put it? The word is syncretism. Scholars say there's a syncretic tradition of where you have all this Greek thought and philosophy. You have the writings of Plato, right, and Aristotle. And they already have these frameworks in their mind for understanding God. And then Christianity comes on the scene, and they're trying to make sense of it and its claims and the apparent sort of radical monolatry that it tends to pose, which is that there's one most high God who is above all. He is the most high. There's one most supreme being. But yet they have all these other conceptions. So, of course, they're going to have an influence on each other, is the point. Obviously. Like, how are people like Dan, creators like me, really anybody, how do we get the short end of the stick where we're just acknowledging, like, duh, the culture is going to have an influence? That's like what it is. I mean, I'm sorry. I have to provide receipts. Every little thing I say on here gets picked apart. Okay, I got to provide you a quick receipt. So a good example from an early writer is going to be like Justin Martyr. Textbook example of what I'm talking about. So look at this. Okay. Vigile Christianae, phenomenal work covering this time period with a section on Justin Martyr. They says, there is little doubt, at least in more recent scholarship, that Justin's writings demonstrate an evident knowledge and engagement with Middle Platonism. Okay, he makes mention of Plato throughout his works many times. Even after his conversion, Justin found many aspects of Christianity deeply consonant with Platonism. And as a Christian, he maintained Platonic conceptions of the divine and even considered Plato to be dependent upon Moses. What? Like, yes, of course. Justin's highly educated, right? He's got access to Aristotle and Plato, and yet Christ changes his life. He hears the gospel and he gets changed by it. But like, he's still trying to comprehend that through a lens in which he already has, right? So, I mean, and at this time, without the unique utility of the person being distinction, ousia hypostasis, he says things that later guys just couldn't say. So like, I mean, you know that Justin Martyr many times calls Jesus another God. And I mean, Trinitarians will defend him to no end, right? We'll just whitewash that. Like, oh, well, really, he just means another who is God, right? He doesn't mean another God. Like, okay, dude. Like, the point is that other theologians later couldn't say those things, and they don't say those things. Okay, so again, I think Dan he just provided a fair recap of all of these sort of things going on. And so he's saying, you know what? Listen, the problem's not really with the people who don't understand this. The problem is with the Trinity itself, which had to develop, which had to sort of respond to different controversies and things of their time, right? That had to deal with Christianity and all these outside influences, like merging together in the ancient world. Man, I gotta admit, it's sort of frustrating that I think this is just so obvious when you read the data, and yet, let's see what happens. I wonder if it gets misconstrued from here. I've seen it certainly before on social media. Let's see how it goes from here.
Very good. And we'll get the fit for this video at the end. So that's just a little bit of good YouTubery to keep you hooked until the end. Dan can tell us what the fit is for this video. So Dan, this is in the mode of a YouTube short, and so you're going to use analogies like algebra problem, and you're going to talk about emperors flying in off the top rope and that sort of thing. Tell us sort of how would you forward this now in a more scholarly way with Dr. Josh opposite you? what kind of language would you use about the algebra problem and the institutional power issue?
Well, regarding the algebra problem, I would say that what we see in the Bible is we see, I think there's a spectrum of representations of Jesus' relationship to God, where sometimes Jesus seems to be equated with God, and sometimes Jesus seems to be rather starkly distinguished from God. And the algebra problem was a reference to the attempts to try to reconcile all of this, try to bring it under one conceptual roof and account for all of the different representations of Jesus using one theory, one model. And the reason I talk about the presupposition of univocality is because without that, you can say, well, John had a specific, or the author of the Gospel of John had a specific Christological framework they were working with. Paul had a different Christological framework. Mark had a different Christological framework. So when trying to consider how these authors understood the relationship of Jesus to God, we don't have to make them all work together. We can allow them to operate on their own terms. And so because my work is in the representation of deity, divine agency, including divine images, this is a question that my doctoral dissertation was addressing. What's up with divine images? How can a divine image both be the deity and not be the deity? And even like you have an author saying, well, this is the deity, but also simultaneously it's not the deity. So that was the question I was trying to answer, and it strikes me that the attempts to bring all of the different Christological models of the New Testament together under a single methodological theoretical umbrella is similarly trying to account for is and is not.
Joshua Sijuwade does not look impressed. Look at his face right now. He does not look happy. Right? Look at him. He's just like, I'm not sure. He doesn't look too happy about what he's hearing Dan say.
The same time. So there's I have a specific way of approaching at least how the author of Gospel of John does that. That's probably the book I've worked on the most. Now, when it comes to the institutional, the imperial side of things, we have a lot of debate. Starting in probably the middle to late 2nd century CE, it's heating up at the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th century CE. And once we have the legalization of Christianity, once we have Constantine's patronage of Christian leadership, and there are a lot of communities, churches are being funded imperially, Constantine seems to have a role in determining at least what kinds of questions need to be addressed and engaged. The Council of Nicaea is an example of Constantine convening one. There was one shortly before that I guess he didn't think had adequately resolved the issue, so he decided he was going to attend the next one personally.
Is that Antioch?
And then, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the result was a specific creed that the bishops were supposed to sign off on under penalty of exile. Now, the degree to which that was enforced is debatable, and we see a lot of back and forth between Arian and Nicene leadership and power struggles. We even had an Arian emperor for a time, but things wouldn't really be resolved for a while. But imperial authority was in the background the entire time. There were ways that bishops would appeal to that in order to defund certain churches, in order to confiscate property, in order to label some of the labeled disagreeers as heretics, which had legal consequences associated with it. So the point there was to show that we probably would have just continued to argue about this on an ecclesiastical level for centuries had not the imperial authority come in to say, okay, we're going to leverage the resources that we have in order to try to enforce this as well, which contributed, in my opinion, to a slightly shorter trajectory towards some kind of unity, which resulted in empires splitting off and some schisms.
Dan is being so careful at everything he's saying right now. Notice how he hasn't said a thing about Constantine's intentions. Right? He hasn't said, oh, he was just trying to unite his empire. But he's not saying on the opposite extreme either. Like Constantine was a genuine Christian, just trying to fix it all up, right? But I think he's given a fair characterization, right? That the government got involved. That's the reality. Okay, the debate got sponsored by the government at the time, Rome, all the way up to the emperor himself, who had significant influence. That's true.
Because there were groups of people who refused to subordinate themselves and their positions to that imperial authority. So I think the power struggles that are associated with this cannot be minimized, cannot be ignored. They played a significant role in how the arguments played out on the ground.
Now, I want to focus most of all on the algebra problem issue and the logical problem thing as well. But just on that point, before I throw to Josh, on the issue of how the Trinity has developed prior to Constantine kind of presiding at the Council of Nicaea, if you've got the Synod of Antioch, which sounds incredibly Nicene and seems to represent the Arian position as a vanishingly small, proportion of what the ancient church was saying. To what degree can we say that it's institutional power that's holding in place a fundamentally incoherent doctrine of God? Because it seems to me like the Council of Antioch was obviously very pro-Nicene, I think a coherent kind of thing, and did not have imperial power behind it.
And which is why the Council of Nicaea was convened, because there was no formal creed that was written up. There was no censuring of the Arians, and I think there was a concern that this didn't actually resolve much because, one, it was not ecumenical in scope, but also there wasn't really any. There were no stakes really for the folks who were anti-Nicene or who were endorsing the position of Arius. And I think this is probably what precipitated Constantine's desire to call and specifically attend the Council of Nicaea and add some significant stakes to that. But when you look at the argument, I think you do see some ebb and flow, because I don't think you have something that could be called Nicene earlier than, say, Origen. I think you get the trajectory in that direction, starting with probably Tertullian and Nero.
Look at his face, man.
He needs some milk.
Look at him. He is just like not on board. He looks like he is struggling right now. Right? Doesn't he? This is hard for him to hear.
Irenaeus. But I think there are steps that are taken at Nicaea that were not taken before. You brought up homoousios. This was something that was actually rejected much earlier because it was the conceptual frameworks were not in place for this to settle into a position that was widely considered orthodox. But I think Antioch certainly demonstrates what the consensus view at the time was, but precisely because there were not really stakes involved, it didn't really seal the deal. It didn't resolve the issue.
No.
And Nicaea didn't either. I think it took another century and a little bit before we got to the point where people kind of broke up into their groups and said, we're pretty comfortable with where we stand now. So, and that's why I would say that the imperial power is salient. It is relevant to the settling of the question.
Yeah. Okay. I do think one of the things that Nicaea brought was not just Constantine, but it also took bishops from beyond the empire, who took it as a kind of a binding creedal declaration as well. But I don't want to get too caught up on that second point about the imperial power, because I do think perhaps most of our back and forth has probably been on the logical and algebra kind of issues. And we haven't heard from Josh. So Josh, I don't know actually. I reached out to you back in February when I first saw that short, and all I was aware of is that you had some reservations about that short. I don't even know what those reservations are. So over to you, Josh. What were your first reactions to that short that we saw?
Yeah. Okay, now this is scholarly dialogue, so please don't take it in a way that I'm sort of dunking negatively. I just believe that it was completely wrong, what was stated factually and given the data. Can I just ask you, Glenn, is it possible that there can be openness with dialogue between Dan and myself? Because I can ask him some questions.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
to
Don't
clarify that I
feel like
don't
you
wanna-
have to go through me. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, the first thing, Dan, is that I just want, because I think we're working with a term that we haven't really defined. So when you say the Trinity, what do you mean by that? So if someone was to ask you, what is a doctrine of the Trinity that can be stated in a sentence that you said wasn't existing prior to origin and it was sort of in piecemeal, in Irenaeus, Ignatius? Yeah, what is that as you understand it?
Well, I think I was addressing the idea of the Nicene concept, but fundamentally, it seems to me that the Trinity is the idea that the single God exists as three co-eternal, co-equal, consubstantial persons.
Yeah. Okay, and then can I ask you, where do you find that stated in any authoritative Nicene document that there is a single divine entity that exists in three co-equal persons? Do you find any Nicene authoritative statements that says it in that way?
I think the Pseudo-Athanasian Creed is probably where it's most kind of conveniently and efficiently stated. But it strikes me that what Nicaea is trying to do is articulates an idea that brings together the oneness, the unity of God, as well as the distinction, the triunity of the persons. Now, I think you're an advocate for. I apologize. No, go ahead. I don't want to go off on
No worries.
tangent.
Yeah, so the reason I'm asking is just, yeah, so I have some basis to understand where what I want to respond to. So I would firstly disagree in the sense that you said, because my question was an authoritative Nicene document. The Pseudo-Athanasian Creed is not a Nicene document, and it's also not authoritative. So it wasn't binding because it wasn't promulgated by any council. So it was something that was taken up in the Latin-speaking part of the church later on, and it became authoritative in what we call today Roman Catholicism. But in the first millennium, it was never taken to be an authoritative text. So what we have to take as the data to construct the doctrine of the Trinity is what...
A work by Athanasius was never taken to be an authoritative text. Did I hear that right? Okay, the Athanasian Creed, because I mean, I take it like, is that a degree statement, right? So, you know, it wasn't formed like ecumenically, right? At an ecumenical council. Is that what then makes it so it's not like, like it has no authority whatsoever? Also, I wonder why he would be looking for that specific language anyways, why he would ask for that. Because the reality is the fact that there is nothing that really says that just harms his view, because he still believes that they all thought that, though. Right? So that was a little weird, right? You're going to, he said, I'm trying to not dunk as bad. You're going to not dunk as bad on Dan by pointing out that you don't actually have a specific formulation. That's supposed to support your view, right? No, they just derive that stuff based on what they do have available. I mean, not even the Nicene Creed, right, says it that clearly. I don't know how that helps him.
Well, two things. The first thing is the creed that was promulgated at Nicaea in 325 and then at Constantinople at 381. That's the authoritative statement that was declared to be the way in which the doctrine of Trinity is to be understood. And then secondly, with less authority, but with still some authority, are the consensus of the theologians who were surrounding and within the pro-Nicene trajectory. So that would be individuals such as Athanasius of Alexandria.
And
that would be also the Cappadocian Fathers. So
wait, so he does have some authority? Well, didn't he just say a moment ago that the Athanasian Creed did not have any authority? But now, just like I just pointed that out. But doesn't he have some authority? So now he's saying he does? That's
Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa. So
yeah, those are all like Eastern theologians. right? Gregory of Nyssa wrote not three gods, right? Clearly, because there's a math problem, right? That's but
They would be ways in which we can further explicate and understand what the document that was promulgated that we call the Nicene Creed. And so then when we look at the Nicene Creed, the doctrine of the Trinity as it's stated in the way that you stated it is not found there. It says very clearly, once you take the statements of the Creed, that there is one God the Father. It starts off with that. We believe in one God the Father. Then it moves on to the Son and says that the Son is true God of true God, homoousios with the Father. That means he's of one essence with the Father.
Yeah.
Then but it also says he's begotten of the Father. Then it goes on to the Holy Spirit to say that he proceeds from the Father and that he is worshipped and adored or glorified with the Son, with the Father and the Son. And so from that, what the Creed is expressing is a simple statement that there is one God the Father and two relationally distinct divine persons, the Son and the Spirit, who are of the same divinity as the Father. The term they use is homoousios, but just for the audience, it's the same divinity. So that's what the Trinity is.
Yeah.
So anything that doesn't fall into that categorical statement.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think Dan disagrees with that, right? He asked him to give him an explanation in like one sentence, right? That's where he gave him that of course. Jesse Judah says, do believers even read their Bibles? Yeah, I think they do, just maybe not a lot or maybe not too seriously. Mr. Tyree says, he qualifies in the first millennia and this creed does not apply to the EOs. Yeah, I know. Respectfully, I need clarity. Paul, or you're debating with someone, I see. Mr. Tyree says the Athanasian Creed is not from Athanasius. Yeah, I know. It's just that's just what they named after him. I was using him as an example, though, right? Like they didn't think that it had any authority, not even from a lower level, right? Not like being ecumenical. I think that is what he means. Oh, and you commented again. Mike seems to misheard Josh. Yes, and his creed has not seen it during this period, nor does authority EOS today. Yeah, I know. They're not like authority. I mean, pick a church father, right? How authoritative are they really? It's sort of hard to tell, right? It seems like the real authority seems to come from the group effort of when they come together. You have everybody represented, right? That's what makes it ecumenical. So I am wondering. So it just seems like Sijuwade said, I totally disagree. He really mischaracterized that. But then he just, okay, but like based on what evidence? You asked him the question, how would you say the Trinity in one sentence? And he did it. And then you're like, oh, well, that specific language doesn't appear anywhere. Really, how it's authoritative is through Nicaea and Constantinople. What? Okay. Of course. Of course, right? Dan doesn't disagree with that. That he seems a little fishy, to be honest. Sort of my honest take there. It seems fishy how he's debating that. Dan doesn't disagree with that.
Of one God the Father and two relationally distinct divine persons who are of the same divinity as the Father is not the Trinity. And so what I then would say is that as understood in that way, there is no conceptual problem. There is no logical problem. And so that's why I push back and say that this wasn't an algebra problem. It's an algebra problem if you state the Trinity in the way that you stated it, but which I believe is erroneous. Okay. That's where
Have you heard or seen Dr. Sijuwade's work? Yes, absolutely. I've seen some of his other discussions. I talked about it at the beginning of the stream. I like a bunch of his work.
There is a conceptual problem. And that's why the first person really to make this into an issue was Richard Cartwright in the 1970s, going into the 80s, with his logical problem of the Trinity. And what was his starting point? The Athanasian Creed. It wasn't the Nicene Creed or the Constantinopolitan Creed. It wasn't the Cappadocian Fathers or the Athanasius and the pre-Nicene Fathers. So if that was the case, then you wouldn't have ever had a conceptual problem. And so my pushback, firstly, to what you're saying is that it was an algebra problem seeking a solution, is that that's not correct. It was trying to understand the relationship that the Son has to the Father. And one of the key issues was, is the Son correlative with the Father? Or is he a created being? So it was trying to understand what divinity does the Son have in light of the one God who is the Father. And
okay, so genuinely frustrating, folks. Oh my gosh. So I felt like I smelled this from a mile away. Okay, so let's run with that. Okay, so the real debate wasn't a math problem. It was about the relationship between the Son and the Father. How are they related? How does that really flesh out? Okay, well, folks, depending on how you answer that, yields a math problem. Okay, because if you make him divine in a certain way, then that's going to be understood as either modalism or two gods. That he just hit him with a nuh-uh. That's it. Your conception is totally wrong. Actually, this one is right. It's not a math problem. It's about the relationship between Jesus and the Father. Come on, Josh. Like, yeah, of course. But like, depending on how that's answered, it can become a math problem.
So then that was really the main challenge that people were trying to conceptualize from the biblical corpus up through the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries into the 4th century. And then in the latter half of the 4th century, we had the Macedonians, the people who were called the Pneumatologians, who are, that's just a term that means spirit fighters. And they started saying the spirit is not homoousios with the Father. And so then it became an issue of trying to clarify the spirit's relationship to the one God, the Father. And then you have the promulgation of the Creed in 381 that allows us to say that the Son and the Spirit are of the same divinity.
Yes.
They're homoousios with the Father.
Yeah.
So
listen, he's not wrong in that, but what's wrong is saying that means it's not a math problem. No, that's the whole point, right? Talking about the relationship between the Son and now the Holy Spirit, that's Constantinople, right? So he's right to point that out, but that is how it becomes a problem of, well, how are they divine? In what way? How do we count them? I mean, it's not a math problem. It's this. What would you call that? There's a fallacy name for that. What is it? Oh, man, where essentially there's a false equivalency? Is that maybe what I'm thinking of? Like a reverse false equivalency? I gotta think about that. But yeah, he's really setting up something that's not really true. Both those things could be true, right? What Josh says, and that it's a math problem. I gotta look that up.
If I was to use this in biblical terms, it would be answering the question of what Jesus said to his disciples: "Who do you say I am?" That is what the question was trying to. And it might have been framed differently by different theologians, but it was trying to answer that question. And this is just not my own take. This is the take of one of the leading scholars in patristic studies, John Baer, who wrote three important works, 3 volumes: The Way to Nicaea, the Nicene Faith, Volume 1 and Volume 2, where his central...
Yeah, okay, it's called a false dilemma. That's what it is. He created a false dilemma. So he painted the picture that it's not a math problem. It's actually just them trying to understand the relationship of the Son and Spirit to the Father. That's a false dilemma because it actually is that very thing, how you understand that relationship, that yields a math problem.
Guiding question is that he saw throughout the historical corpus was the question of, who do you say I am? That was the question, in trying to understand the relationship to the Father. So I've talked quite a lot, but I've got a bit of things to say, but I can stop now for anything you might have to say, Dan.
Dan, what do you want to say?
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. That sounds like the monarchical Trinitarianism that you've advocated for in print, and I'm sure in your forthcoming book. And I actually think it's kind of closer to the position I've advocated in some ways than a lot of folks who endorse some other framework other than monarchical Trinitarianism, because you talk about how, at least in John 17:3, for instance, that the only true God is the Father, which is something that I think is, I think there's a sense, my reconstruction of the way the Trinity developed is wrestling with the sense in which Jesus is Theos or God, and I think that there is not an attempt to try to bring together Jesus into the single identity of God. So I actually appreciate monarchical Trinitarianism more than some of the other frameworks that I've seen. Now, I think fundamentally, however, there is still a sense in which even monarchical Trinitarianism is trying to wrestle with the tension that we find in the Bible and within early discussions about how God can be one while also Jesus can be distinct from the Father. And we see this expressed in a number of places. And in some videos, I've talked about Origen's commentary on John, where he talks about how there are a lot of people who are scared that if they say Jesus is distinct from God, then how can they affirm that there is one God? And they go so far as to conflate Jesus with the Father in order to say there is one God, because they're afraid that saying Jesus is distinct from the Father is going to be something like ditheism. So I think in the reconstructions of the development of the Trinity, I think in the patristic literature that we see and within the Bible, we see a tension between unity and distinction. Now, the exact framework for resolving that tension, I think, differs between the different Trinitarian models. And when I was talking about the Trinity, I was primarily talking about the way it's conceptualized today. I was trying to speak to an audience that understands the Trinity in the way I represented it, not necessarily saying the Trinity up through the Cappadocian Fathers, but excluding pseudo-Athanasius. I wasn't trying to speak of it that way, but in the way that it is generally represented today. Would you acknowledge at least that contemporarily most Christians who think of the Trinity think of it in a way closer to the pseudo-Athanasian Creed than to the monarchical Trinitarian framework? Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, continue.
You would,
continue.
okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, but would you agree with that observation about how people talk about the Trinity today?
Yeah, so I do agree with that. And so I make this distinction sort of in my work, my written work, and when I have dialogued and spoken on this.
This might come the identity predication distinction right here.
That there is a distinction to be made between the common understanding of the Trinity and the conciliar understanding.
Maybe not.
Okay.
Or the traditional understanding. And so what I, in my most recent work, have been using the term is I don't use the term monarchical because I don't want it to come across that there are different ways in which one can understand the Trinity. Instead, I want to say that there is one way in which the Trinity was understood within the pro-Nicene trajectory. That is the conciliar context from the first council at Nicaea in 325 to the second council of Nicaea in the 800s. And so there was one way that was understanding the Trinity, and that is, again, one God the Father, two relationally distinct divine persons who are of the same divinity as the Father. And so what the issue is, though, and why I can explain why historically that was the case, that the common understanding came up, is because of the influence of Augustine in the 4th century and 5th century. But very interestingly, Augustine is not a Nicene authority. So he's a very influential theologian, but he wasn't at the Nicene Council. He couldn't read Greek very well, and he even admitted to this. So he wasn't in dialogue with the Cappadocians. So he was working within his own intellectual context. And so he was the first person to identify God is the Trinity. So he was the one who used the nominal sense to name God. Instead of saying there's one God the Father, there is one God the Trinity. And so that from Augustine, who then grew in esteem in the Western or Latin part of the empire, Latin-speaking part of the empire, we then have this being taken up. And then with the Athanasian Creed developing later on, and then also with the splitting in the 11th century of the Latin speaking church with the Greek-speaking church, we then had the influence of Augustine growing in esteem, the influence of the conciliar context of the Latins growing in esteem, and a reduction of the authority of the Eastern context. And so if people were aware of the Cappadocian Fathers, the Athanasius, and the pre-Nicene Fathers, like Irenaeus and Ignatius and Athenagoras and others, they would have understood that this was never an open question. This was never an issue. It was settled. And this is why the filioque was such a problem, was because you are then making two sources rather than being a single source or sole principle who is the Father. Because the one God is the Father because he's a sole principle. He's the monarch. He has the monarchy of the Father, the monarchia. And so that's why it was a big problem for the East. And so that's why in the Eastern common understanding of the Trinity, it is the conciliar understanding as I expressed it. We find this in our liturgical sort of document. So, for example, Basil's Anaphora, which is part of the Divine Liturgy, it identifies the one God with the Father and then speaks about the divinity of the Son and the Spirit in light of the Father, who is the one God. That is within the liturgical context, not just written documents.
Yeah.
We also find in later concilia pan-orthodox contexts. So, for example, we have the Council of Blackany in the 14th century, which restates not the Augustinian understanding or the Latin understanding, but the Nicene conciliar understanding, the one God, the Father, and the two. So that's one.
Listen, I gotta be honest with you, okay? If for this statement that, oh, well, we really believe that the one God is just the Father alone, you're okay, then you're not a Trinitarian. You're not a Trinitarian, okay? Because if you also believe that Jesus and the Holy Spirit are equally God with the Father, right? They're equal, they're consubstantial. Then how can the Father be the one God? How, that doesn't make any sense. Now we're back to the math problem, which I feel like neither of them are really addressing head on, right? I mean, the core issue here is that if they're really one, how are they distinct? Right? They're really one being. Okay, but if they're really distinct, well, then how can they be one? They're truly distinct from each other. And if both those things are true, then how are they not three gods? How is modalism or partialism off the table? Right? That just doesn't make immediate sense. Dan is coming saying, like, listen, you're not the problem. The doctrine is the problem. This doesn't make sense. How is they getting to that? All I'm hearing from Sijuwade right now is that they slap another term on this, the concilio model. How is that? That was a terrible, terrible attempt at copying his accent, but like the conciliar, right? Let's just tack on another word here and say this was really it. That word conciliar, let's look that up, by the way. Conciliar. Conciliar is an adjective meaning relating or issued by a council, particularly in ecclesiastical church history. It refers to decision-making or authority held by a collective body rather than a single leader, often associated with the historical conciliar movement where councils claimed authority over the Pope. So the word I used earlier in the stream was like lateral. They have this lateral view, which is that, listen, all the councils are authoritative. And through each of them now being posts, we look back and we can determine what it was that is the truth because they have the authority. Right, and this is what they mean by saying it's conciliar across them from beginning to the end. Okay, so, I mean, there should be obvious issues here, which is that there wasn't just the repeating of the same thing. That's sort of what I feel like I'm getting from him here. He's like, the one God is the Father, and that's a repeating thing. Like, okay, but that's not the only concepts going on here, right? You also have the Council of Chalcedon with the hypostatic union, where now, Jesus has two ousias, but he's one hypostasis, right? And then there's the whole question on how many minds does Jesus have? How many wills? And they, of course, determined that he had two of each, right? 2 minds, 2 wills, but he's not 2 persons. Not 2 persons, Nestorianism, right? So, okay, how does that fall in this conciliar view then? Because that seems to be something new, right? That's new. That wasn't explicitly stated. Is that just as clear as there's one God the Father? No, of course not. That word kind of gets thrown around, I feel, to kind of smear it, make it a bit like it muddies the waters a bit. It does muddy it. I wish that he would get more to the math problem, right? I thought that's what this debate is about, the math problem, right? Okay, so the one God is the Father, and then that solves it? Is that sort of what that means then? Again, what is the relationship between them? And then you have the hypostatic union. Like, how does that fall into the equation? Please.
I'm saying you can say yes to common understanding because of the influence of Augustine and the Western Church. That's how it's been understood. Within the East, It was never understood in that way. And that's why I've made a big issue of trying to go back to that.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, you're arguing that this understanding of God as the only true God and Jesus and the Spirit as the same divinity but not the one true God, that's the earliest, the original, the authoritative understanding until it was to some degree corrupted, or whatever language you want to use, and that has become the dominant view, and you're trying to restore an earlier, more historical view. Would that be an accurate couching of what's going on?
Yeah, I wouldn't put the my task in that way. It's more of highlighting, similar to yourself, of sort of further highlighting how Second Temple Judaism and Christianity and other ancient Near Eastern contexts, how they understood deity. It's similar to myself of highlighting how the conciliar fathers and the context of the councils understood the Trinity. But it's not. It's not like this is what I'm doing. This is how it is understood in the Eastern Church. So, for example, in the Eastern Orthodoxy, this is how the Trinity is understood. As I said to you, Basil the Naphara in the liturgy is central to the practice of the faith. So, and then I spoke about Pan-Orthodox Council. So, it's more in that.
Like, listen, like, guys, Unitarians believe there's one God the Father. This is not really saying anything. This isn't solving the problem. Just because everybody says that there's one God the Father doesn't mean they're saying the same thing throughout each time period here. I mean, that has to be substantiated. There is a ton of evidence that, especially the pre-Nicene fathers, that when they're calling the Father the one God, they were assuming an ontological subordination. But Sijuwade's here telling us that that really doesn't conflict with the idea that they're all fully divine. Right? So he holds both those things. The Father is the only true God, but Jesus and the Spirit are still fully God as the Father. Right? They're fully divine. They're God ontologically. They're homoousios. How do those two views mesh? I don't think that they do. I really don't think that they do. And it's interesting that it's really the Eastern theologians themselves who seem to talk about this the most. Again, the math problem. They're the ones that Gregory of Nyssa is not three gods. A ton of the critiques to them, those works have not lasted. Much of what we know critiquing them is in their writings critiquing them back, in all the different against heresy works, the heresiologists. So I wouldn't just give that to him. How do you know that when they're saying one God, that that's not ontological subordination? I think that's a harder claim to support. Sure, they all say one God. No, they don't all mean the same thing.
Academic context, saying, hey guys, if you realize this is not actually the historically grounded understanding of the Trinity or the scripturally grounded one, so let's re-emphasize this now. More so than saying, hey guys, we need to rediscover this new thing. I've done it myself or something, because it's still an open thing, and the correct understanding in the Eastern context. Yeah.
Right, which is kind of in a minority position, globally speaking. At least in that sense, it's a minority position.
I wouldn't accept that. I wouldn't accept that.
No, you wouldn't accept that. Okay.
No, I wouldn't accept that at all. Because it depends. Minority is relative to a context. So It depends. If you're saying minority of lay folk, then fair enough.
Yeah.
But lay folk...
Yeah, Tyree, you're totally right. It really is all about the definitions. Absolutely. And so much about like discerning that is like, you got to like read a lot of their writings. You got to see the big picture view, right? The bird's eye view to kind of understand. It's true.
I would include lay folk.
Lay folk can understand many things, many wrong things about God.
Agreed.
That doesn't say this is what the position is in the scholarly discourse, in the patristic sources. Because in the patristic sources, I can list a number of very influential patristic scholars who would side with the way of understanding the Trinity. And then also within the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, which is the second largest form of Christianity globally, this is the understanding of the Trinity. So I don't think it's correct in minority relative to lay Western influence theologians, but not so much here.
So we've got
there's a ton. He's just, you got to grant him for that. A whole ton. I mean, if I were just to recap what's going on, right? You have Dan saying, listen, there's this problem with how do you understand Jesus, the Holy Spirit, being, equated with Yahweh, with God, having these divine titles. How do we understand this? Is it three gods? Is it not, right? It's a math problem and that lies with the Trinity. You're not it. He says, okay, I think you're totally wrong. Okay, how do you know he's wrong? Well, because you make Dan give you a definition of the Trinity in one sentence, and he says, one nature, three persons, and that's not really it. It's really that the one God is the Father. And that solves it, because the real debate was about the relations. What's the relationship between the Spirit and the Son to the Father? Again, false dilemma. Both those things could be true. Right? That's how I have always perceived it myself, right? The debate about the relationship of the Son and Spirit to the Father is what does or does not yield a math problem. That is the debate, isn't it? Right? How is Jesus God exactly? Hello? Like, that's it. Okay, and now he seems to be really putting all the emphasis on this idea that, in the conciliar view, the councils, there's what the authority is, and they maintain the same one God the Father. Okay, that doesn't prove that they all perceived that the same way, especially at Nicaea. Folks, even just the works of Eusebius alone, it really does look like homoousios was understood in different ways. It was a convenient way to try and condemn Arius and unite them, but they didn't all really see it the same way. And then they switched back after. You know that the following emperor was really an Arian. And they tried to repeal everything. It's such a muddy story. I just wouldn't grant him all that. I wouldn't grant him all that. And I don't feel like we're even really on the math problem yet in this so far.
Some Eastern and Western issues going on as well.
What do you guys think? Please tell me in the comments. What do you think about this so far?
Which will take some parsing out. But all parts of the church can affirm the creed. All parts of the church can affirm the Nicene Creed. And I guess one question I've got for you, Dan, is I think you're right to say that if you stop the average, let's say the average evangelical Christian in the street and say, what is the doctrine of the Trinity? I think you probably will get them to say it's one God in three persons, and I don't know how it works. I think that's probably true.
A few days ago, we had one of my wife's friends over from a different group that she was in, and they're both Christians. We had a great dinner. We made some food. We were out chilling, and he asked me about my life, and I said, yeah, I do some YouTube. I talk a lot about the Trinity, and first words out of his mouth, were, I believe in the Trinity, but I don't understand it, and I couldn't explain it to you. My wife, she heard that, and she looked at me and was like, ain't that how most people view it, right? That's sort of the thing. And then we got into a huge theological debate. I'm joking. We didn't even talk about it. I can have dinner without talking about the Trinity. Thank you very much. They were super kind, by the way. I had a great time. It was fun.
But that is not to say that they are not Trinitarian in a much richer sense, which is, if you show them the Nicene Creed and you say, does that make sense to you? I think your average, even 21st century, completely Protestant, Western, evangelical Christian, I think they probably get that that it is a proclamation rather of Jesus, really, that the second article of the Creed just takes up all the kind of the real estate in the Creed, that it's a proclamation of...
I hope you're wrong, Faithfully Rational. Really? Do they not actually even get to a math problem? Please tell me Dan does not just give it to him. Yeah, well, I guess the one God is just the Father then in your view. What? No, they have to explain the metaphysics. They have to explain the logic, right? There is the LPT, there's the MPT, the metaphysical problem, the logical problem. How do they fix these things? That's what I thought this was going to be about.
This Jesus who is God from God, light from light, very God from very God. Now, whether they then try and pass that into a logical mode? They probably don't. They just probably think, yeah, he's God from God, in the same way that you can have light from light, in the same way that you've got radiance that comes from the sun. There's a oneness to that radiance, and there's a distinction to that radiance. Jesus, there's a oneness of Jesus to the Father, and there's a oneness, and there's a distinction. And most Christians just happily kind of live with that. What would you say to that?
I think that is precisely what I'm addressing. My video is, as a public scholar, I'm trying to make content that speaks to the layperson on the street. And so every podcast I start off by saying we try to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion and combat the spread of misinformation about the same. So I am addressing the layperson and trying to address the way that they have been taught about or think about or talk about the Trinity. But fundamentally, what I'm trying to get back to is that this tension between unity and distinction is one of the main catalysts for the debates, the need for councils, the development of these frameworks. I think that is the main issue that I was getting at, and I think that's where an awful lot of lay folks are going to punt and just and speaking in American football terms, and I think that's the tension, the algebra problem, so to speak, that I was addressing is how do we understand their unity and simultaneously their distinction, and that's where I think if we go back to the Bible, we're going to get very different perspectives from different authors that I would say are closer to, Josh, the framework that you're describing than to the traditionally understood framework of the Trinity, but I think not quite the same. I don't...
Man, I'm struggling, though, with this. Guys, I mean, come on. Everybody's going to define the Trinity in a sentence. Like, Joshua, and still, man, look at his face. Bruh. This guy does not look happy throughout this debate. Or this discussion. But, I mean, just consider that if you asked anybody, explain the Trinity to me in one sentence, they're going to be like, God is one being, one nature, right? In three persons, right? Or one ousia, three persons, one what, three who's. I mean, come on. Like that's how most people are going to do it. He's saying, yeah, well, it's really the one God is the Father. Okay, we know that. How does that really solve the problem though? Like, does he reject that description? Right? Are we not allowed to say that God is one what and three who's? He brought up that one guy, what was his name? Who said that really God is equal to the Trinity, that the Trinity is God. I was wondering where that actually fell into his model, because you realize that's like totally incoherent, right? I mean, if God is equal to the Trinity, then neither person can be God, because neither single person is equal to the Trinity, right? So if we were going to run that in a syllogism, you would just ask someone, is Jesus the Trinity? No, right? He's not identical to the Trinity. All three of them would be identical. Okay, so then if the Trinity is God, then Jesus is not God because he's not identical to the Trinity. Really, that's going to follow any which way you try and dice it, because there's just parts. There is just parts. Like they say the persons are fully God, but you could just ask them then, okay, is the Father and Son the Trinity? No, right? No. Is the Holy Spirit the Trinity? Is the Holy Spirit the whole of the Trinity? No, clearly they have to exist in parts, in some way, shape, or form. I mean, everybody's going to give you that simple description. Okay. I wish they didn't, though. I'll give them that. You got to respect Josh for that, right? They should instead probably be saying, well, actually, the one God is the Father. And then we can just help them understand it's Unitarian Christology, theology that grounds that properly.
Think that the author of the Gospel of John or Paul or the author of the Gospel of Mark or the author of Daniel or any of the other...
Yeah, I figured, Tyree. Yeah, assuming you're talking about the Trinity is equal to God. I assume he did. He didn't really make that clear, but that would just, muddy the waters.
First Enoch, any of the Second Temple Jewish texts, I don't think those are going to fit into that framework quite the same way. But Josh, would you say that you agreed or disagreed with the idea that tension between unity and distinction is one of the main catalysts for the Trinitarian debates and the need for councils and things like that?
Great question, right? How were they distinct if they're really one being? How are they one being if they're really distinct? There it is. What's he say?
I would say it's a tension, but it wasn't the need for councils. So I disagree with the conclusion. It's not entailed. So it's a non sequitur. I don't believe that's the reason why we had the councils. But I believe...
Well, okay, like the Council of Nicaea, you could argue that because they were really wondering whether Jesus was, they interpret being homoousios as like being co-eternal, right? They were consubstantial. So the Son was not created. That was like more of the debate per se than how, given that fact, are they one God? Okay, you can give them that in the Council of Nicaea, but the debates in between, not the same, not so much, right? Then we get the Council of Constantinople, right? Then we get the Council of Chalcedon. There was a ton of debate that happened in between these times. You must realize that.
There was a way in which people were trying to conceptualize the relationship of the Son to the Father, who is the one God, in a sense that does not ontologically subordinate him. But can I just ask you a few questions, because I know we don't have super long.
Yeah.
So you said that the Gospel of John doesn't have sort of this, or it doesn't fit perfectly into this framework that I'm sort of expressing, if I'm correct. So how do you interpret just one verse, and one of the most famous verses, the prologue of John? So John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. How do you interpret it?
Well, I start from the observation that I think is probably a consensus view among scholars today, that the anarthrous pre-verbal use of theos in this predication indicates a qualitative sense. Now, I would argue that this is probably reflecting the logos theology that the author is, in some sense, adopting from Philo. And Philo talks about how the article is included when it's referring to the one who is truly God, and it is omitted when it is talking about those who are improperly so called. And he talks about, I think it's Genesis 31:13, where God appears to Jacob and says, "I am the God who appeared to you in the place of God." And Philo goes, well, that's odd. Why doesn't he say in my place? Is there another God? And then goes on to say, this is a reference to his chief word, or logos. And then in his commentary or questions and answers on Genesis, the logos is the second God. And so I think John is picking up, I have a paper I'm going to be presenting in Rome next month, where I will talk about a hybrid logos.
That was quite the statement. I have a paper I'll be publishing coming soon in Rome. Let's just blow past that. That was a dope line. How many times did you hear that?
/ image Christology in the Gospel of John. And so I think that there is a distinction between hotheos and between theos and arthrously, and that Jesus is is being called divine, is being called deity, is not being identified as the very God of Israel. And I think in John 10, when he appeals to Psalm 82, I think we have kind of a further fleshing out of this notion that humans can be gods. You have the anarthrous plural, thei, quoting the Greek translation of Psalm 82, And that is in response to their accusation that he's committing blasphemy by saying he's one with the Father. And he says, wait a minute, your very own scriptures that you're not allowed to annul say that humans can be gods, the ones to whom the word of God came. And so I think there's, and this is why I think what John is, the author of the Gospel of John is doing is much closer to the framework for which you're advocating, that there is a sense in which the Father is God in a distinct way from the way that Jesus is God. I would say that, and you see this anarthrous distinction being drawn. I think Justin Martyr uses it without explicitly calling it out. Origen explicitly calls it out. Eusebius explicitly calls it out. So I think there's definitely a recognition that the way that Jesus' deity is distinct from the way that the God the Father is ho theos.
So what do you ask, Josh?
Yeah, so I don't see how that data, 'cause I know you're big on data, so that data doesn't actually support then the position that I'm expressing, because I said there's one God the Father, and
Yeah.
there are two relationally distinct divine persons who have the same divinity as the Father. Now, if you take exactly as the way that I...
How do they have the same divinity as the Father if there's only one God and that's the Father? I mean, that's incredible, folks. Hear that one more time.
normally interpret who have the same divinity, God the Father, then the position that I'm expressing.
Right
Because
here.
I said there's one God the Father, and
Yeah.
there are two relationally distinct divine persons who have the same divinity as the Father.
How is the Father the one God if they have the same divinity as the Father? How does that work? How does that flesh out? Isn't that the debate? He's just restating that, like, this is just an assertion. This is not an explanation of how such a thing could be true. It's not even addressing the problem. Ice Fire Earth says, if the Son is eternally begotten, does he share the same age with the Father for monarchical Trinitarianism? So thank you so much for the $5 super chat. So I believe the answer is they're going to say yes. Right? He has, quote, the same age, which is going to be eternal. There was never a time when the Son was not. But I'm going to tell you that eternally begotten is a self-contradiction. If you're eternal, you're not begotten. If you're begotten, you're not eternal. That's how those words function in the Bible. That's like what it means to be begotten. That had to be developed later philosophically. So, do you guys see what I'm saying in chat? Please tell me you understand this. Just saying, yeah, well, the God, there's one God the Father, and that's like meaningful, right? That has explanatory power. But yet, still, the Son and Holy Spirit are equally divine with him. How does that make sense? Like, is he maybe chopping this up to mode of existence? Is that like sort of like what he means? So the Father, right, exists from his own self, but the Son and Spirit are generated, right? The Son is generated, the Holy Spirit spirate. He's spirated. How exactly is that fleshing out? I hope he explains it.
Now, if you take exactly as the way that I normally interpret the prologue is in the exact same way you have just explicated it.
Okay.
It's saying that in the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was with ho theos. So it's saying the Word is distinct from ho theos. That fits with what I said. There's a distinction between them. But then it says the Word was theos, divine. So then that's data that supports exactly what I'm saying, because it's saying there's one God, the Father. So it says ho theos, the God, that's the Father, and there is a Son. So you can even replace it now and say and just restate it as, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with the Father, and the Word was divine. So then that's data that supports my position. So when you're saying it doesn't fit, perfectly, I don't see that. I see it's supporting data but it's not. I'm not saying we just build it off of that, but just by even starting at the beginning of John, you already see it. So what I see again is that you were...
Yeah, well, it depends on what you mean by divine as well. That's exactly the same thing Dan has said, that you could translate John 1:1. Just in case you're not catching it, when he's talking about being anarthrous, the second theos lacks that definite article. That's why Josh is saying, and the Word was with the Father, because in the Greek it's ho theos, it's the God, and we know that the God is the Father. That's why he's reading it that way, and the second is divine. Dan agrees with that. He accepts that. But Dan doesn't think that that entails Jesus is just as divine as the Father. I think that's where the rejection would come. And if he was, then how is the Father only the one God? Right? So Jesus is just as much God as the Father, but the Father is only one God. I'm not like, this is not explaining this at all.
Attacking an understanding of the Trinity, which isn't the correct understanding. Because the correct understanding, where it identifies the one God with Jesus in a stronger sense than just him being divine, then that's problematic. But that's not what I was stating is the conciliar position. So
Okay.
I've stated for a long time that there is a way to draw between the word God, which is ambiguous, the nominal sense and the predicative sense. The nominal is as a name, and then the predicate is as ascribing a characteristic to something. So the way that the word God is used very regularly for the Father, just even in John. So for example, the most famous verse probably for a lot of people is, God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. It doesn't say the Father. So it already uses the word God as a name for the Father. So it interchanges very easily. But then also you see John saying that the Son, as you even were admitting yourself, the Son has some form of divinity. So that is evidence for that position that I was expressing. I think that's data that should be taken as supportive data.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I if I were forced to choose a Trinitarian model, I think yours makes a lot more sense to me, and I think is allowing the data of these texts to operate on their own terms a lot more fully than a lot of other folks. I would suggest that I agree with you regarding how John 1:1 distinguishes God the Father from Jesus. I think the sense in which they are united is where
Told you, he agrees with that.
where I would argue there's a disconnect, because I think that
Wait, let's hear that one more time.
there's a disconnect is where I would argue there's starting how John 1:1 distinguishes God the Father from Jesus. I think the sense in which they are united is where I would argue there's a disconnect.
Right. How are they both divine in the same, really essence, this one numerical thing that they both just are?
Because I think that, and I think it might come down to the notion of monotheism. Because would you agree with Philo that the Logos is a second God, or would you impose a strict philosophical monotheism on even the Gospel of John, insisting that there is only one God?
It's very clear that there is only one God. And so because Jesus is not the Father, that's the way to answer it. Because the Nicene Fathers are very clear. Like Gregory of Nazianzus says in his orations, very famous. He says, we say, and I've actually got it here. Let me, sorry, I just wanted to bring the data as such. But I wanted,
How much time do you have, Dan? Can we go for just a little bit longer?
Yeah, we can go for a little bit longer.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, let me just 1 second. So I can read it here. Gregory of Nazianzus, this is oration 25:15-16, a very authoritative set of sermons. Again, Gregory was actually the presiding bishop of the Council of Constantinople that promulgated the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. He then left because of different reasons, but he was the starting one. So it expresses his theology. So he states, one God, unbegotten, the Father, and one begotten Lord. His Son, referred to as God when he's mentioned separately, but Lord when he's named in conjunction with the Father. The one term on account of his nature, the other on account of his monarchy. And so it says a principle for how Trinitarians are to speak. Yes, you can call the Son God because you're saying he's divine. But when you're speaking about the Son and the Father, you refer to the Father as the one God. And so Philo, if it's sort of a trap that someone could have of falling and saying, is there a second God? Well, you're counting two beings there. And so the principle would say, no, you wouldn't say there is a second God because there is only one God, the Father. So for example, Basil of Caesarea says, and this is in against Sabellius, his letter to against Sabellius says, there is one God because there is one Father. But the Son is also God, and there are not two gods, because the Son has identity with the Father. For I do not behold one divinity in the Father and another in the Son. There is an identity of substance because the Son is from the Father, not by a command, but rather begotten from his nature, not separated from him, but perfect radiance of the Father. He also says in another...
So we're just going to grant all that metaphysics? We're just going to grant all the presupposition and how they have to make that logical? Right? We're just going to give that to him? I hope Dan calls this out. Notice, too, how he said, he's like, no, we wouldn't say that. Yeah, great. Why? Why would you not say that? You don't just assert, nah. Like you just point out an entailment. Like, wouldn't there be two gods because they're both God? No, we wouldn't say that. Okay, what?
Bruh.
Explain it, please.
Part of Against Sibelius, he says that we must believe in God the Father omnipotent, on Christ Jesus his Son, and the Holy Spirit. Moreover,
Hard facts. Deuteros Theos. Yes, Philo does.
that the Word is united to the God of all, because he says, I and the Father are one. So it's quite clear. And also that in this, I didn't have the specific quote, but in the rest of the quote, the first one, it says, we have never heard of a second God. Because of the understanding of monotheism was synonymous to monarchia. So monotheism, as you all know, came in later as a term. And so a lot of Second Temple scholars, such as Paula Friedrichsen and other people working in Second Temple Judaism issues and Christianity, they were saying retire the term monotheism because it's not helpful in capturing what the Second Temple period was understanding.
Yeah, the better terms are like monolatry or henotheism, something more like that.
Well, the Second Temple period and the the post-biblical times, so the pre-Nicene and Nicene times, they never used the term monotheism. They used the term monarchia. Right. We believe in one God because there is one Father, yet the Son is
Yeah, so that's what they use in their actual writings. I'm talking about like the scholarly commentary who talks about like an umbrella term. Have you guys ever heard that before? Let me just look that up for you, just in case you've never heard that. So henotheism. Henotheism is the worship of a single primary God while accepting or acknowledge the existence of other lesser deities. So many believe that this is something that captures what they actually believed better than just monotheism. Let's look up monolatry. Monolatry, belief in the existence of multiple gods coupled with the exclusive worship of one single deity. Okay, so if we compare this to monotheism, it just says like the existence of only one deity is the belief in the existence of only one deity. So my understanding was that this never really ruled out the existence of other gods. That's how I used to perceive this term, but I guess that's really not how it functions at a scholarly level. It is sort of this belief that like there's only one God, and then everything else called God is just not in like any way or form, and there's no other. Like all other gods are false gods, pagan gods, whereas these terms are going to acknowledge the existence of other divine beings who may be called God in some sense or another. I'm sure you guys have heard this before. So the concept if he's talking about in terms of like replacing something better than monotheism is the monarchia, talking about the monarchy of the Father. Now, we'll continue this, but yeah, Unitarian views ground that far better.
Usos with the Father. He's of the same divinity as him. And so that's why we say, Gregory Nazianzus says, the Son referred to as God when mentioned separately. And he says, the one on account of his nature. So he's God because of his nature. So it's a predicative.
So Dan, what do you want to say to that?
I think this is where you and I would probably disagree because...
he should ask him, what do you mean by nature?
I mentioned at the beginning that I wanted to look at when monotheism developed and for my second master's degree and ended up going in a different direction. However, when monotheism begins has always been a focus of mine, and I've got the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion, their essay on monotheism I wrote and published last year, where I discuss the development of the concept, and I argue that it's actually not in the Bible. What Henry Moore came up with the term 1660, the grand mystery of godliness. There is one God rhetoric that you've referred to in the Bible, in Second Temple Jewish literature, in early Christian literature. But I think that you see an effacing of this willingness to acknowledge a second God, as Philo calls it. Justin says another God. Origen does as well. I don't think after Origen, you might know better than me, I don't think after Origen anybody endorses the second or other God language, because I think that's where a more philosophical approach that understands one God language as denying the existence ontologically of any other being that can be called God. This is where I would say John is willing to acknowledge plural gods. In fact, John has Jesus asserting, hey, your own scriptures that you're not allowed to deny call these humans gods, thei, plural gods. And I don't think that we have that strict philosophical framework being imposed on the understanding of Jesus as theos in the Gospel of John. I think you see it as late as Justin Martyr. We have a very similar logos theology that Justin Martyr is presenting, talking with Trypho, saying, I will prove that there is another God.
Yeah, nobody later was allowed to say things like that and get away with it like they were. They get a pass directly because the language by which to properly define such things didn't exist yet. That's really why they get a pass, and of course also because Trinitarians want to make it appear as though they've always been here, right? Yeah, really, Justin Martyr was a Trinitarian,
beside the Creator, and so I think that's probably where the disagreement is, because I think their unity is not necessarily in the existence of a single soul being that is God. I think their unity is, and this is where my image Christology framework comes in, is in the notion that Jesus bears the presence of the Father and therefore manifests the presence of the Father, which is the intuitive logic of divine images. This is how people would have encountered gods every single day throughout the Greco-Roman world in public. And I think one of the manifestations that this framework is what's going on is comparing John 14 and John 20. In John 14, it is Thomas who asks Jesus a question, and Jesus gives an answer, and then Philip says, "Show us," because Jesus says, "The one who has seen me has seen the Father." And Philip goes, "Well, just show us the Father." And Jesus says, "No, you don't understand. The Father is in me, I am in the Father." And it repeats it a couple of times. And then I think Thomas is standing right there in the narrative. And then the idea here would be Jesus as a walking, talking, breathing, speaking divine image.
I said I agreed. Sorry, I was muted.
Because of his reception of the glory of God, the name of God, one of these vehicles of divine agency bears and manifests the Father's presence. And so to see him is to see the Father, which is, again, exactly how divine images work. And then in John 20:28, Thomas finally gets it, sees the resurrected Jesus, and realizes that in seeing Jesus, he also sees ho theos and is able to declare, my Lord and my God. Thomas finally gets what Philip did not get. So I would suggest that their unity is the conceptualization of their unity is facilitated. And this is what I said in that clip. There were these intuitive cognitive frameworks that were not well understood in this time period. The author of the Gospel of John is presenting Jesus as a divine image who bears the Father's presence.
The divine image.
Pardon?
He's presented as the universal, unique, and eternal divine image. So
yes,
with that tweak, I can agree 100% with what you say. that from the beginning, he has been the Word. And
yeah, so if he's conceding to that, they just lost. They just lost. That's the best line I think Dan has dropped this entire time. Quickly, we got the Capri Sun for the win. Yeah, I know. I got the Pacific cooler right now. Listen, I'm an adult. And I have money now, right? What's holding me back from getting a Capri Sun? I remember in school, we didn't always have them for like our lunch boxes, and any day, we had a Capri Sun. It was the best. I still have those memories. These are awesome, and they make them with less sugar now. W. Am I right? Refining Exegetics, thanks so much for the $5 super chat. He says, when Gregory of Nazianzus says Jesus is God by nature, all he's saying is that Jesus is God by the unique conception I have in my mind right now. Based. Absolutely based. Okay, let me show you this. So I think it's really going to be, we'll probably just take this. Okay. So let's pull up accordance, bring this over. Let's quickly look at this. So if we go to DEU 18, and we don't speak Portuguese, so we're going to put that in English, right? Okay, down to, all right, this passage right here. So Deuteronomy 18, let's just pull out these verses quick. 18 through 22. Okay. I will raise up a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. Okay, did you catch that? It's subtle. Ready? I will put my words in his mouth. Notice the distinction between them in this language. And whoever will not listen to my words, that he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. The prophet who presumes to speak, so you notice how they're just not the same being in this text, right? It's Yahweh's words in him, and his name is in him. That's the logic of divine images. Jesus said, my food is to do the will of him who sent me to accomplish his work. I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just. Because I seek not my own will, but the him of him who sent me. My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. This is all the Gospel of John. Right? You got to keep this in mind. This is all the Gospel of John here. You know not from where I come, because I do not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. Here it is. I have not spoken on my own authority, but the Father who sent me has given me a commandment what to say and what to speak. This is exactly what Yahweh said is going to happen with the Messiah. Right? That's it. That's the lot. So Jesus is identified with Yahweh as his Messiah, the one who speaks for him. Right? He will put my words in his mouth, and all that who won't listen to my words, which he will speak in my name. So, point being, if they concede to that, I think they lose a big part of what this debate is actually about. Because the whole thing is, how exactly is Jesus divine? Is that going to muddy up the waters of how there's only one God who is the Father? If he's equally God with the Father, equally divine. Everything hinges on how that is defined. So Dan's saying, listen, there's already a conception for understanding someone who represents Yahweh, who's treated as Yahweh, but is distinct from him. This would have been the conception, not the Council of Nicaea, right, in 325. Not the Council of Chalcedon. No, it would have been agency, the Jewish principle of agency. What is it? There's a few other good verses here. Where is that he says, Jesus called the apostle in Hebrews. This is also a good one to bring up. Where is that verse? Hebrews 3 verse 1. Let's just pull that up and then we'll continue. So Hebrews 1 verse 3. No, excuse me, I got that backwards. Hebrews 3:1. Boom, 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 boom. Okay. Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of our confession, who is faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in God's house. Okay, apostle. Let's look this up. In the BDAG, what does this refer to? It refers to a delegate, an envoy, a messenger. Of messengers was extraordinary status, especially of God's messengers, an envoy. Right? So it's just well known that they are closely related. Jesus is identified with Yahweh. He's treated like he has Yahweh's authority and words and teachings and acts, and we believe he does, right? But that doesn't make him Yahweh ontologically, by divinity, right? He's not Yahweh by nature, just like the Father is. That's not a conception here in their minds. How would they prove that? That's anachronism. That's taking later ideas and importing them into this.
And even in the scripture that you cite in terms of John chapter 10, when Jesus quotes Psalm 82, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? If you call them gods to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be set aside, what about the one whom the Father set apart as his very own and sent into the world?
And sent into the world, yes.
So it's an ad majorem kind of, you can call those divine beings, and you can use, theoi about them, but there is the one set apart by the Father from before, right? And I would say, together with John 17, you loved me before the creation of the world. There is one set apart. He is the divine image and has always been that divine image. That's John's understanding. Would you say that that's at least John's coherent understanding that Jesus is the eternal, unique, universal image?
Tyree says, boo, host, laugh out loud. Boo. Tyree's hitting with some fire comments in the stream.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think John is approaching this from a very traditional Second Temple Jewish framework of, anti-idol. There are no other divine images. Jesus is the one as the Son of Man, as the bearer of the name. And I've argued before, I've been criticized for it by some colleagues, and so I'm fiddling with my articulation of it. But this goes back to, and I pointed out in my response to you, Glenn, the angel of Adonai in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
Exodus 20, 23, 20, and 21, I'm sending an angel before you to guide you on the way.
Who
Don't
Philo
disobey him,
also
don't kick him off.
identifies as the Logos, who is the second God.
Precisely.
Yeah, right.
Precisely.
So that's actually a very
John,
ancient understanding then. So we don't need the tools of later philosophy to understand that. John could understand alongside Philo, who was interpreting Exodus 23 and saying, there is a sent one of the Lord who also speaks of himself as the Lord. He is God from God, light from light, the Word. So it's quite an ancient understanding then.
Yeah, my argument is that this goes back to we don't need to appeal to later philosophical frameworks to understand how the author of the Gospel of John is understanding the unity of Jesus and God, because we find it already in the Hebrew Bible with the messenger of Adonai. And in my book, Adonai's Divine Images, which is a revision of my dissertation, it's open access. Anybody can read it for free online. I develop an entire framework for how divine images were renegotiated in the exilic period and where this angel is coming from, why this angel becomes this kind of animated divine image. And so that's the framework, Josh, that I would say probably distinguishes my approach from yours, where in regarding their distinction, I think you and I are a lot closer together than we might be to other Trinitarian theoretical frameworks. Regarding their unity, I am suggesting that there's a different framework that was already in place that would have made sense to the author and the audience of the Gospel of John, that I think is slowly being replaced probably between the late 1st century and the late 2nd century CE with a more philosophical approach where we're shifting to a one God conceptualization of their unity, probably with, you mentioned Athenagoras, I think Irenaeus and Tertullian are probably the main pivots towards emphasizing this unity on grounds other than what I think was intuitively underlying the representation of Jesus as Theos in the unified sense. And
I think that's so much better. That makes so much more sense of the data. We don't have to be playing around with odd metaphysics that, may or may not be pagan, depending on how exactly you want to say they got them, all right? As well as just avoid all of the useless division and dogma over these things. The reality is that even people who are in full agreement, right? I was speaking with Jacob Hansen a few days ago, and he affirms that Jesus is of the same nature as the Father, fully divine. He perceives that in a totally different way than Trinitarianism. You really can't just grant a lot that's in there. So I think that's true. Bear, I see you say, anyone else see these sparkling dots on the screen? Is that part of Mike's stream? Yeah, so that's how would you say it? The plugin that's allowing me to bring up your comments. It's supposed to be like a nice sort of background thing. Maybe I should choose a different theme. If that's annoying, let me know.
I'll shut up now. I've been talking for a while.
Okay. So in my own written work, I use a term which is we're sort of conflating on some points in that you use the sort of terminology divine image. I use metonymy. So Christ is metonymically bearing the divine name, Yahweh in that. So I don't see much problems with that. I would actually draw more the distinction. I think that the history that you've stated is just incorrect. Because I think what I'm trying to express here specifically is that from the New Testament period through the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries up till the 4th century, we have an understanding of the Trinity understood in that way. And so then what needed to be done is to conceptualize the elements of it better. What does it mean for the Son to be relationally distinct from the one God?
Oh, that's frustrating. Let's catch that line again. Tell me that's not just an assertion.
Trying to express history that you've stated is much problems with that. I would actually draw more the distinction. I think that the history that you've stated is just incorrect. Because I think what I'm trying to express here specifically is that from the New Testament period through the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries up till the 4th century, we have an understanding of the Trinity understood in that way. And so then...
Yeah, nice assertion. Where's the data? Dan just presented a ton of actual data on the matter, right? He quoted you from, John chapter 14, verses 20, compared to Psalm 82. He brought up the angel of the Lord and how that was brought about, right? He talked about the different conceptual understandings of Yahweh's messengers, right? In those who represent him or who speak as him. Guys, the prophets speak as Yahweh, right? The priesthood held unique roles that really, they represent Yahweh to the people, and their words and his messages and will is revealed to them through them, right? The Levites really acted sort of almost as like a ruling class for them. Like that's, granted it was, he was speaking for like a minute or two. It's not like he gave a full 30-minute presentation, but that was some data. That was some data to back up the claims. And remember, we just went over a few scriptures from the book of John further outlining that very narrative. What is Joshua giving us? I think you're wrong. Actually, there is this, everybody believed it this way from the time of the New Testament to the councils, right, and the creeds. That's just an assertion. Where's the data on this? How do you know, right? Dan brought up Philo. Dan brought up Origen, right? Cited specific parts of their works, right? Where is that from Joshua here? I just get a lot of, you're totally wrong because I assert otherwise. Okay.
What needed to be done is to conceptualize the elements of it better. What does it mean?
Yeah, guys, they fully understood it, but we need more work on the elements of it. Wow.
Mean for the Son to be relationally distinct from the one God? Is he correlative or not? What does he mean to have the same divinity as the one God? So he can be predicated the term God. Is it in a homoousion sense, or homoiousion sense, or heterousion sense? So there are various ways people needed to conceptualize.
If there are various ways in which people needed to conceptualize it, then how are you so sure that they were all telling the same story from the New Testament to the creeds? Yeah, okay, like these are just some more assertions. Fantastic. Great. Like, yeah, we really understood it, but we got to develop the words, right? It was truly consistent, but we had to develop a whole new language to understand it, right? They all really believe the same thing. I mean, the smokescreen here, this is bothersome to me. It just is. And this is nothing against him personally. I'm sure Joshua's a solid guy. And again, I appreciate his work in other areas. But man, it's like always with the Trinity. Always. It's like logic and main reason just kind of goes out the window. To me, it's just immediate disconnect. How are you? You just said he's wrong. They're super consistent, but now you're giving about how they had to develop the language like that. Those don't make sense. That does not add up. Okay.
But there was one overriding framework that I believe is found within the scriptures, the New Testament, up through the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century, up to Nicaea. So it's not starting from origin and onwards. And I want to evidence this again with the data and that. So I would say, okay firstly, we have
here's the data. Here it comes.
Individuals that state very clearly. So remember, just for the audience, the Trinity, as it's correctly understood within a conciliar context, is there's one God, the Father, and two relationally distinct divine persons who are of the same divinity as the Father. Now,
got it.
Now, we have Hermas stating, believe that God is one who created and established all things, bringing them into existence out of non-existence. So that is in the latter part of the 1st century going into the 2nd century, whichever way you date it. You have Irenaeus in 180 to 190 writing in Against Heresies, here is alone God, alone Lord, alone Creator, alone Father, and alone contains all things and bestows existence on him. We have him stating in further writings, God the Father, increate, ungendered, invisible, one and only deity, creator of the universe. We have Theophilus of Antioch, who states, from nothing God created whatever he willed as he willed. The power of God is manifested in this, that one out of these things there are not what he makes whatever he pleases. Tertullian says, we believe, and this is in the 3rd century, we believe in only one God, yet subject to the dispensation, which is our word for economy, that the one only God has also a son, his word, who is issued out of himself. Okay. Then we have, last person I'll say here, we have Gregory of Famatugaris, who says, in the creed that we have that survived, there is one God, Father of the living Word, perfect begetter of the perfect begotten. And this was in 270. Now, we then...
Oh my gosh. Wow. Oh my gosh. All of those were about one God the Father. Does Dan's model not agree that the one God the Father was the claim of the Bible? This logic of divine images presupposes that who's the divine image that they are a part of, right? Like, who is the one that the image represents? The Father. None of these have anything to do with proving the relationship between Jesus and the Father. That's what you were saying, right? That there's one God the Father and two relationally distinct persons who are fully divine with him. That was his definition. What did all those quotes just support? The first half of that equation, which everybody agrees. I guess I'm a Trinitarian. I'm an Orthodox. In fact, this is great news. This is wonderful news. I'm Orthodox. Who knew? Right? Like, this is so weak. Oh man, Mr. B, he's proving our position exactly, right? Bear, he is cooking. Unbelievable. Here's the data. Here's the data that proves that you're wrong and I'm right, except you actually, all you did was kind of play yourself because you didn't give the evidence for the whole position you're arguing for, which is that really it's about confirming that Jesus is fully divine with the Father, right? That's what you're trying to maintain with this claim that the Father is the one God. Just giving us texts that say that the Father is the one God does not prove that. Wow. There's a lot There's a lot he's just expecting to be given to him in this discussion.
So we have the one God being very clearly established. But then the question, so that's the first part of the Trinity. There is one God the Father. And it's found in the late first, second, third century, as I stated. But then we have the divinity. The question then is he of the same divinity as the Father?
Oh, but guys, maybe I spoke way too soon. Is that evidence now coming? Is the evidence now coming? That's correct. Remember, that's exactly what I said. Yo, where's the evidence for the claim of divinity? All right, here we go.
We have Ignatius of Antioch who states into the Ephesians, a letter to the Ephesians, our God, Jesus Christ. We have him then stating God incarnate. So he wasn't a mere man for Ignatius of Antioch. This is a late first century, going into second century scholar. We have Justin Martyr, who you were...
Wait. Hold up.
God incarnate. So he wasn't a mere man for Ignatius of Antioch.
You realize that God is not a rigid designator. God is just a title. Is that what he's about to give us? Texts that call Jesus God, and that somehow means that he's of the same nature as the Father in a Nicene sense? Is that what we're getting right now?
This is a late first century, going into second century scholar. We have Justin Martyr, who you were already saying called him God. But there's something interesting he states in dialogue with Trypho. He says, this power is indivisible and inseparable from the Father. So he takes the Word, the Son, to be inseparable and indivisible from the Father. Now, how to conceptualize that wasn't a way in which I'd say Justin had the resources, but he already was predicating an indivisibility, not an independent deity, but an
So, listen, that's not really true.
Indivisible one, inseparable one from the Father.
Okay, so again, it all depends on what we mean. So Justin Martyr, yeah, he believes that they were indivisible in terms of like their ousia. So he does. So Justin, you can give that to him. So he says, for example, that the fire kindled from fire example, right? He says that this how this operates is that, you know, one flame is no less diminished because it starts another, right? So they are the same essential thing. That's what he means too when he says that, you know, Plato, you know, rightfully appealed that, you know, the Most High God exists in this fiery ousia, right? That's really not the issue. The issue is that Justin really contextualizes that statement. Remember, another God, which he concedes that he says, in light of the intermediary principle of Middle Platonism. For Justin, Jesus actually did, like, saying that they're of the same divinity is not getting him, again, to Nicene Trinitarianism, because he was still subordinate in an ontological sense. So Justin, he thought that the high God was too transcendent to engage with the material world. So he engaged with the Logos as an intermediary principle. That would be a good question to actually ask Joshua to get his thoughts on. Like, does he think that the Father can engage with the material world apart from his word? Be very interesting to see what he says back to that. Just calling him God, just predicating some divinity to the Son does not get you to full-blown Nicene, Constantinopolitan, Chalcedonian definition Trinitarianism, okay? That's not even it. And again, I would actually disagree with this characterization of Justin.
You then have Athenagoras in 177 stating, God from the beginning, being eternal intelligence, had his word in himself being eternally rational. Then we have in the key...
Yeah, okay, so what? So what? I believe in the pre-existent word. I'm a Unitarian. It means nothing.
Key one here, Irenaeus, who states, the Father is God. And this is, demonstrations of the apostolic teaching. He states, the Father is God, and the Son is God, for whatever is begotten of God is God. Another last one for this.
God from God. Congrats. That's just like Justin Martyr, the fire kindled from fire. We can give you that. That doesn't make them, homoousios, not even that, let alone how that develops into like two natures theory. You don't get that.
For Irenaeus, he says, the Son is of one substance with the Father. This is against praxis. And then I'll just say two more here. There is only one power. Sorry, this is Hippolytus. There is only one power, that which issues from the all. The all is the Father, and the power issuing from the all is the Word. He is the Father's mind. Thus, all things are through him, but he alone is from the Father. So it's
The New Testament says that. That all things come through the Word, through Jesus, right? All the, 1 Corinthians 8:6, right? One God the Father and one Lord, right? Through whom all things come. That's in Hebrews 1. How this is proving the divinity as he sees it? I can't.
predicating one power between the Son and the Father. Last one here, and this is a key one. And this is Novatian, who was existing at the time of Origin, but he wasn't a post-Origian individual, so he wasn't influenced in that way. Novatian states, the Son is God, and this is on the Trinity. He states, the work on the Trinity. He says, the Son is God inasmuch as he derives his being from the Father, and the Godhead has been transmitted by the Father to him. There is a...
Okay, if the Son derives his being from the Father, then he is clearly ontologically lesser than the Father who does not derive his being from another. Like, certainly we must agree that a being whose very existence depends upon another whom he is not as great as a being who does not possess that dependency. I mean, that's just me, okay? That's my view. I think that's rather basic. Whatever the reason for that is, right? All of these, and like another thing too through this is that he's hitting us with a lot of like logos and wisdom traditions, which evolved themselves. Scholars call them logos theorists. Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Origen, Hippolytus. Logos theory developed in various ways, and it sort of was kind of dependent upon wisdom tradition. Like, they spoke of them in a similar way, but when they use terms like logos, they're really associating that more again with Middle Platonism than they are with how that would be derived from a wisdom tradition, right? So if you've been watching some of my recent debates, you might know some of this. But if we like come here, come on. We pull up, let me just quickly show you that, John 1:1. So in the beginning was the Word. This word here, logos, this falls under definition number 3. And look what they tell you about this. So here it is. You see John 1:1 right here. See in red, it shows you that's the one this definition falls under. Okay, so it's an independent personified expression of God, the logos. It's a personified expression of God. It says our literature shows traces of ways of thinking that was widespread in contemporary syncretism, as well as in Jewish wisdom literature in Philo. The most prominent feature of which is the concept of the logos, the independent personified word of God. Okay, so how did they understand the logos? It was based on the literature which predates them, right? That they had a cultural milieu around this, how they viewed it. That was in light of Philo, of Jewish wisdom tradition, and a little bit of contemporary syncretism. All right, and this is how they understood, say, verse 14, where the Word becomes flesh and dwelt among us, right? What is the Word? What does it mean to say the Word becomes flesh? It even puts it here, the distinctive teaching of the fourth gospel, that the divine Word took on human form as the person Jesus. What is that Word, the divine Word? It's a personification of God. It's the expression of God's wisdom. Like, God has wisdom in his mind, and then he expresses it through his speech, word, talking, right? This is just like in Genesis. That many scholars believe this is appealing back to Genesis. Oh, look, it even says it there. You see that? Look. Source is Gen 1:1. Right there as a source. I guess that happens when you hover over the A. That's what many scholars believe. Because God created the world through his word. And God said. You know what I'm saying? So like, that's what we should think of when we hear the word, right? We should think of that contextual rooting. That's what grounds this, not homoousios, right? Not two natures theory. And so like, you can grant a lot of this. Yeah, Jesus can be considered divine in a way. He can be called God in a sense. Just being called God or being called divine or even God from God, right? Or being of the nature in a sense that's qualitative. That none of that gets you to his complete view of Orthodox Trinitarianism.
Community of substance, communio substantia in the Latin. So I struggle to say how there isn't the same divinity that's seen by the Son with the Father. Yes, the term homoousios might have not captured it at that sense. We have Origen and others who come after him using that. But the key thing, we have individuals who are stating it. Sorry, I just want to speak about one more evidence. This is a good one. Gregory of Thaumaturgus says, there is one Lord, unique of unique, God out of God, impress and image of Godhead. Okay? And then in the triad, there is nothing either created or servile. So if he's not of the same divinity as the Father, then he has to have a degraded divinity, a created divinity, which was what Arius was promoting in the 4th century. So we already have in the 3rd century there being an identity or oneness of substance, where there is nothing created in the Trinity, as Gregory Thaumaturgus said. So
what's that supposed to mean?
I'm oh gosh, sorry, I want to say Dionysus.
Like of course. I mean, the Nicene Council was to solve a controversy. There was a big deal. Of course, it had led up to that. That's kind of the point.
Of Alexandria, last one here. Sorry, let me just say this. So it's.
I think I spoke a little bit too early. At least he's giving something. You gotta pay him that respect. You do. He's giving some data here. I think the data is weak though, because he's just being called God, being called divine in some sense, and even acknowledging that that didn't exactly flesh out to homoousios till Nicaea. But they're the same, right? But they're the same in divinity. That you don't get that from just acknowledging being called God or divine.
Athanasius restated it, so we find in Athanasius Preservations. He says, and this is in 260. So again, he's a contemporary of Origen, but not an influenced of Origen in the sense of he's a post-Origenian scholar. He says, parents and children are different people, but are homogeneous. The plant and its seed or root are different, yet of the same nature. So the river and its source are different in form and name, but consist of the same water. So it's using an analogy to say that there is an identity of what the Son has, the Father has as well. So I'm struggling to see again how that's not evidencing, and we can speak about the Spirit as well. So the Trinity doesn't seem to be something that is just predicated on origin and later on. Can I just say one more thing? Because I just want to correct one more thing, just last thing. It's a question I want to ask you. So when you said Council of Antioch, what Council of Antioch were you referring
about the development of the...
Oh no, I'll rewind. Yeah, no, I was bringing up what a funny comment, right? Look how giddy the host is thinking Josh is cooking.
Together to debate this issue. He suggested, but only suggested, the term homoousios at the end of the debate to be able to express what they had agreed about.
Okay, wait, back up a little bit.
Of Bishop of Rome, 80, where he promulgated understanding of the creation, the homoousion of the Son with the Father.
Okay.
It wasn't until Theodosius I in 380 where he promulgated the Edict of Thessalonica, where he said the religion of the empire is Nicene Christianity. And he said the religion of the empire is that of the faith of the Bishop of Alexandria and the Bishop of Rome. So he was saying two of the central bishops, because Constantinople wasn't a central.
Yeah, if you look that up, they're going to call it Catholicism. They're going to say that Rome made Catholicism the state religion under Emperor Theodosius.
Bishop at that time. Two of the central bishops, their faith is the faith of the church. And so the faith of the empire. So what closed the search, as Hansen says and other scholars, was Theodosius, and more particularly the Council of Constantinople in 381. So actually, Constantine didn't do anything. All he did was he had imperial authority to bring the bishops together to debate this issue. He suggested, but only suggested, the term homoousios at the end of the debate to be able to express what they had agreed about, that because they wanted to have something in the creed that would not allow the Arians to affirm it, because you had people like Eusebius of Caesarea and Eusebius of Nicomedia who were playing around saying, ooh, maybe if we say he's of the same essence in this way, we can get away with it. So they had to put that term homoousios to say no. And that was a suggestion by Constantine. But it was nothing after that. All happened was Arius was deemed excommunicated by the council. And all that Constantine did was follow through with the council. So if it was the other way, that the council had agreed that Arianism was the correct faith of the fathers and the scriptures, then it would have been the same thing. It's like similarly, if I get...
Listen, I think that's kind of a whitewashing. I think, listen, in the study of this, you know what? You know who has a great video on this? You know who has a phenomenal video on this? I'll show you right now. We're going to go to Transfigured. Do you know who this channel is? Transfigured. Okay, so he has, let me see, Council of Nicaea. Oh, look, we have a video together here too. So the council, what the creed originally meant in its context. He has a whole section in this. You know what? Let's just watch a little bit of this actually real quick. So where's the part where he goes through? Yeah, he goes through all the main characters. Eusebius to Caesarea. Where does he get to the point of Marcellus? Come on. Here we go. Listen. Just listen to this.
Constantine the Great. He was born in Serbia. His father was a Caesar and then later an Augustus of the western part of the empire. He grew up in Diocletian's court. He received a top-notch classical education. In 312 AD, he becomes Augustus of the West. He had received a vision prior to a major battle to, in this sign, conquer, and the sign was Chi Rho, or XR. Whether he interpreted this as a Christian vision at the outset or later viewed it that way in retrospect is unclear. He
mentioned that Joshua mentioned, or no, which one of them mentioned? They mentioned that he did. He had like this sort of like a conversion experience. That's what many would describe it as.
Battle, becoming the ruler of the Western Roman Empire. He co-issues the Edict of Milan in 313 AD with his co-emperor that grants toleration and not persecution to Christianity. In 324 AD, Constantine beats his co-emperor in a civil war, becoming the sole emperor over the whole empire. In 325 AD, eager to unify the Christian church and responding to alarming reports from his advisor Eusebius of Cordoba, he calls the Council of Nicaea to settle these disputes. Originally intended to perhaps be in the new city of Constantinople or maybe in Ancyra, the city was not yet finished and so was relocated to his lakeside estate in the nearby resort town of Nicaea. It would be almost sort of like Trump hosting it at Mar-a-Lago if Washington, D.C. were under construction. All right, I want to talk about Constantine's own theory. Constantine was heavily influenced by Greek philosophy and Greco-Roman religious traditions, with an especially strong influence from Neoplatonism. He grew up as a kind of pagan monotheistic Neoplatonic mystery cult believer.
Ooh, that's such a good point. Pagan monotheist, right? So the reason why I'm showing you this, right, to get this little bit of information, is because the picture Joshua was just trying to paint is that, oh yeah, Constantine just kind of recommended it because it, sort of captures everything that they needed in order to condemn Arius, right? But he's not doing justice to where that term actually comes from in the context in which it really became the means to discredit Arius, right? It wasn't just merely like, we want to affirm that Jesus isn't created. That's certainly the big thing, right? Whether he was. I even mentioned that earlier in this stream. But it's just the formulation. It's the method, right? The homoousios had prior been used by pagan hermetics, okay, who use that to describe the substance relationship of different pagan deities. Okay, so he's like borrowing this concept in order to try and explain homoousios. That's like its real utility, is that it, like it or not, it comes from the way the pagans were using it. And that's, I mean, Sure, you can argue that they adjusted it some, but you can't actually just whitewash it that cleanly. Constantine, there's a lot of question about how it was meant. Eusebius seems to outright say that everybody interpreted it in different ways.
That worshipped the sun god Sol Invictus, or the unconquered sun, S-U-N, sun, whom he also called the divine mind or the supreme deity. He seems to not have been particularly interested in traditional Roman sacrificial and cultic polytheistic practices. He had Christian teachers growing up in addition to various kinds of pagan teachers. He took theology, philosophy, and God's activity in his life very seriously. He often talks about providence or God's guidance in his life or the life of the empire, and seems to have had received visions, personal prophecies, and other intimate connections with the divine relatively often in his life. His coins, public statements, and monuments are full of religious imagery, symbolism, and language, often with very personal connections, suggesting that he took religion very personally and very seriously as a guiding force in his life, and viewed himself as some supremely anointed divine agent called a man of destiny and history or something like that. However, it's hard to make clear distinctions between his paganism and his Christianity. His early monotheism can make him sound like a Christian from an early age, but his use of pagan imagery and symbolism and references continue well after his supposed conversion to Christianity. Egan Chandler argues rather persuasively that he is best understood as something of a syncretist, where he viewed his Neoplatonic pagan monotheism as fundamentally compatible with, or even the same thing as, his Christian monotheism.
Yes, that's
he
correct.
does show great respect for Christian institutions and figures, and shows a
So, dude, that one's going to throw you for a loop. So that's, you'll learn this. Where is it? Phenomenal book. Give me a moment. I'll show you. Come on, where is it? All right. Constantine and the Divine Mind by Keegan Chandler. Phenomenal book. I think I have this one in my recommended reading list on my Linktree. But like, if you go through this, yeah, you're going to find out that it really does look like Constantine perceived the Christian idea of monotheism, of this one God, as compatible with the same type of pagan monotheism he already had from Sol Invictus. Okay, and he did. He viewed himself as sort of to be this big uniter. So he didn't play this simple role where, oh, I'm just going to pitch homoousius, and if they take it, they take it. No, he convened the council. He held it at his own place. He funded it. He funded the travel of all the bishops to go there, to stay there for a while. I mean, he was just highly involved and influential. And you should read about how they talk about this guy. Oh my gosh. Constantine, the great and most, merciful one, sent by God, ordained of him. And, maybe to some degree, some of that is even true. I'm not going to say that God didn't use him. I mean, he did good things, ending Roman persecution. Phenomenal. Praise God for that, right? But that you can't just whitewash everything else he said. I would check out this video. This whole video is wonderful. You're going to get so much information about the Council of Nicaea. And I think... Isn't it too? So, Unitarian Christian Alliance. There's a video on here by Dale Tuggy. Where is it? Dale has a video right here exposing Nicaea.
Okay, so it seems not then to...
Where he goes through... Where is it here? Does he... I can't read it. There's a whole section here where he talks about Constantine. And basically, he's just going to give you how influential he was in all the different things that he did at this debate. I would check out these two videos. Hard facts. Definitely do that. Let's come back here. Let's see if we can finish some of this out. We're already past... Oh, we're way past 2 hours. We're at 2 hours, 40 minutes. All right. Let's see if we're going to finish up a little bit more of this.
Sent to court and I'm tried by a jury and they found me guilty. All that the police does, or the prosecution service, the security team, is that they enforce what the jury has decided. But I can't go and say, oh, because of that, it was the jury that did anything. No, sorry, it was the prosecution, the police, or the police that did anything. It was a jury. So it was the council that did it. And because they were within the imperial context, it was then followed through in that way. So that's something I want to say. But it wasn't a century. It was closed at 381, going into 381 with the Council of Constantinople.
Thanks,
because
Mark.
why this was the case, last thing here, is because there were multiple councils that people were bringing up. So after the Council of Nicaea, you had other councils and other councils that went and said, actually, no, Arius and Eusebius are fine. And other ones that were saying, no, they're not fine. So you had terms like homoion, you had heterousion, you had homoousios.
The Homoians were big. Did you just catch that? That's worth looking up here real quick. The Homoians? No, so Homoians. Is that how you say it? 4th century Christian group that taught the Son is like Homoios, the Father, but refused to describe him as being of the same substance. Favored by Emperor Constantius II, I believe that's Constantine's son, this moderate Arian faction led by this guy dominated church councils in 359 to 360 before declining in 361. Yeah, so this was a part of the switch back. So after Nicaea, Constantine's son takes over, who's essentially an Arian, and they tried to undo all of that was done. You don't hear them talk about that one a lot too. That's big, man. The Homoians.
Homoiousios, and they were all trying to figure out what was the way in which we can navigate Nicaea. But it wasn't saying that. So what was actually, Theodosius wanted unity and say, we've debated enough for over 60 years. Let's close this question. It's the Bishop of Alexandria and Rome who have the authority. Authority of the faith to set. And he also names later on, after not him, but after it's named, Gregory of Nyssa's named. So one of the Cappadocian fathers is taken to be the one who embodies the faith of the church. So I just push back on sort of the imperial work and actually the authoritativeness of Nicaea. Nicaea became authoritative after the 4th century by the Council of Chalcedon, because we don't have any acta of Nicaea. We actually don't know what happened in Nicaea. We have nothing. All we have is a letter of
Eusebius.
We have Athanasius's recollection of it as a deacon. So we have other secondhand sources, but we don't have anything. It was
that. Whoa! He didn't know. Eusebius is the primary source, and he's the one where you get most of the information from on it. Actually,
not until Chalcedon in 451 that we have an authority of Nicaea, and that's how the church always operates. The councils later on become more authoritative than what they were at the specific time.
So Dan, just the issue of imperial power and authority. Just give us your thoughts on that, and we'll try and wrap things up.
Well, I don't want to carry things on too much, but I would just say I'm not to say that Constantine actually had any role in formulating the ideas, but this is the introduction,
which he did, point blank. He did
This is the introduction of imperial enforcement. And I think
it was literally suggested by Constantine. I think he sold that short a little bit.
While it does take some time for things to iron out, where people are exiled, people are brought back, even Athanasius is exiled multiple times, you do suddenly have imperial patronage being a reward of your position, being the leading one, being endorsed by the empire, which gives an awful lot of power, which allows bishops to exercise an awful lot of control, confiscate property. There were riots that broke out. So it just, the point there, without disagreeing with anything that you just articulated regarding the relationship of the emperor to the actual debates themselves, is that I think without imperial power, we would still be arguing about this in even more fervently than we are anyway. But I think there would have been significantly less unity if there were not imperial power involved in the debates.
Okay. Yeah.
Very charitable ending there. Right? I think he could have pressed some of those points more, but that's certainly fair. How he just characterized that. I mean, it got sponsored by Rome, the Roman government, and again, we want to believe that God used that for some positive things, without a doubt. But not everything can be whitewashed so simply, especially concerning the Trinity. So that's all the time that we got for tonight. We made it through an hour and a half of this debate. Man, I feel like they didn't necessarily get to the math problem too specifically. Man, I was hoping you guys were wrong. Some of you were telling me at the beginning that, there was substance in other areas. But, I mean, quite simply, if God is one being, How are they truly distinct? And if they're truly distinct, then how is he really just one being? Okay, the whole premise of this off the beginning of that video was that Dan was saying people don't get this, they don't understand it, and the problem is the doctrine itself, right? It's not because you're not smart enough, okay? It's that there's a math problem here, and they had to debate about it. Certainly that comes up in different ways. Everything has to be defined and contextualized, but I wish that had been addressed better. It really seems like his whole refutation is, well, everybody's always believed that the one God is the Father. Okay, so you just believe that there's one God, so there's one God? Like, is that what that means? Like, yeah, no. Remember, it was that false dilemma that relationship between the Son, Spirit, and the Father is where the math question comes in. How exactly are they divine? Right? The best it seems like Sijuwade could give were places where Jesus is called God or divine. You can get that from the New Testament. Right? Like, why would you even need to give those examples throughout? The Bible is good enough for that. But I did enjoy it. I wish they had gotten more to the actual math problem. It would have been good to see him get pressed on the metaphysics a bit more by Dan. Dan was super charitable, very nice. But I did enjoy hearing their thoughts. What do you guys think? Thank you all for being here tonight. Let's look at some of these comments before we close out. Ooh, Imago Dei. Unitarians, how do you get to the Father? What does the Bible say? Through Jesus. Hercules says they replaced even the council in ways they did. That one video I showed you by Transfigured, he goes through all the different changes as well between Constantinople. That was a big thing that Joshua was just talking about, that at Constantinople, Nicaea really becomes more authoritative. They removed a ton from the creed, added other things. They updated it at Nicaea. Mr. B says, we get to the Father through his appointed Son. That's right. Heath Master says, you're funny, Ricky. Every magic and wonder was from a false prophet. Oh, I don't know about that one. Mr. Tyree says, really enjoyed the review. Hey, thanks so much for stopping by. You're dropping some awesome comments. Thanks for engaging. Apollyon says it was a very soft debate. Yeah, it was. I was expecting a bit more pressing back. You know, at least just in the sense of the prompt. Right? I mean, at times it's good to be charitable in areas so you can press in the key areas. I wish there was more of that. Everything is his claims about the one God, his claims about Jesus just being called God or divine, and therefore that means he's like automatically equal with the Father. I don't think he fully addressed how Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Origen were calling Jesus God. Like many scholars, dare I say the majority, do think there was ontological subordination in there. I mean, especially people like Tertullian, who were, you know, he was very influenced by Stoicism, and they had very intense views on really immaterial things and whether they were immaterial. Tertullian thought that God was kind of like a thinking gas. He has that statement that, you know, the Son is a derivation or portion of the substance, substantia in Latin. Ooh, that's a big one. So I wish that had been addressed more, right? Even we as Unitarians, we can say that, and we do say that Jesus can be God. He's literally predicated the divine name and given all authority on earth. It's so irritating too when people want to throw that stuff against you. They don't even quite understand it. Father's Joy says, thanks for the live stream, Mike. Abba bless everyone. Great review and chat discussions. Thanks so much for being here. And thank you for the comment. Tyree, Dan was too kind. Very pleasant. Rhetoric and dismissive by Josh Wins in Optics. Yeah, right. Right. You're wrong. I think how you characterize that is totally wrong. Because I said so. Right? Like... Marcus Aurelius says, early Christianity is super fascinating and not something enough people look into. When you do, it really appears there was a drift from the apostles to the adoption by others and a mix of paganism. Hard facts. Hard facts. That's right. Rick Johnson says Tertullian was a heretic. Right, in the Orthodox tradition. Because of a lot of his work on the soul. All right. This is the last thing I'm gonna actually let me show you this. So this is a good example of how frustrating this kind of has been. So I just did that debate, and we were talking about like the Father's power, his authority. Does Jesus have it? And I'm saying yes. And so they're like, oh, so then, Jesus is omnipotent. And I'm like, well, you could say he's omnipotent in some sense. I mean, if you're given all authority, certainly your authority comes from your level of power, right? And, oh, well, then you believe in two omnipotent beings, and they just try and, like flex on you. Look at this. Let's just Google this. This is actually such a good example to end with. Omnipotent, having unlimited power, authority, influence, often used to describe an almighty deity, someone with absolute control. Derived from the Latin omni, all, and potent, it describes the capacity to do anything, right? So, listen, let's be very strict in here, right? People want to be so rigid with me, when yet I think I'm properly describing how these certain concepts should be understood. Tell me, can the Father sin? Can the Father lie? If the answer is no, so then what? God isn't omnipotent? God's not omnipotent then. There's something he can't do. Certainly a God who could sin is more powerful than a God who couldn't. Am I right? No! Okay, like this is not a biblical term. These are just words to try and communicate concepts, okay? Like, for the same reason, I got hundreds of these dudes off God Logic's channel just spamming my content, calling me a polytheist, believing in two omnipotent beings. None of them even understand what these terms mean. They don't understand how they can be applied really with nuance or unilaterally. What's in their view, we might as well just tell them they don't believe in a God at all. Oh, because and plus, I mean, you believe in two omnipotent beings, yet you believe in two omnipotent persons. Okay, how are those functionally different? So it's actually a good example of that. It truly is complicated historically what words like God mean, divine, logos, that's a big one, logos theorists. Omnipotence, right? These omni attributes, these properties, how we think about God. And so I do side with Dan McClellan on this. That, listen, when you study the scriptures, the way that they would understand this is in light of the context of their day, of texts that already exist. Maybe a few extra biblical ones, like intertestamental Jewish literature, Philo. But generally, you're not going to try and retroject what we know didn't even exist. Like the concept of homoousios. He had this dependence on there being one God the Father, and all these creators say it. That doesn't mean they viewed the monarchy like you do. Right? Like even, again, me as a Unitarian, I'm happy to affirm he's called God. He's predicated the divine name Yahweh, right? His name is literally in him. I could even say that God has given Jesus all power and authority. How can we say that? Because of the logic of divine images, right? If Jesus was just God ontologically, he would already have it. Right, you get it. So I hope that just gives you the understanding that this is truly complex, and it's so easy to look at these older writers and just to want to make them say what you want them to say. I think that's a lot of what Joshua was kind of doing. I would not just be granting him Orthodox Trinitarianism because Jesus is called God or God from God or called to gods by Philo, right? It's so funny. But so I think the safer position, if nothing else based on the data, is something like a Jewish principle of agency for sure. And I think that's what Unitarianism teaches and holds the data well. So that's it. That's all I have for you guys tonight. Oh, we got Thomas. Thanks for the comment. Thanks for being a channel member. He says, what do you think about the effects of Augustine's theology had on the Trinity? Is his Trinity different from Nicaea's? Well, overall, we would probably say no, but he did try and describe it in some unique ways. Augustine had a lot to develop in terms of like love theology and how they viewed the relationship between the persons. I wouldn't call it too distinctly different. You know, I would rather be a bit more charitable with him. Augustine was heavily impacted by Platonism. He basically tells us that. Warren McGraw, Idol Killer, has a ton of great content about the impact of Platonism on Augustinian theology. So, you know, he was affected by other things. I wouldn't necessarily do that. Imago Day, thanks for coming. He says you're out. Bear says, thanks, peace out. How is Josh saying metonymically any different from agency? Right. That's a good question. So good. All right. We got it, Heathmaster. I enjoyed the stream. I really appreciate it, guys. If you enjoyed it, be sure to give it a like. Subscribe if you haven't. Maybe share it with someone who might enjoy it. I was hoping it got a bit more spicy, but that was still good. And I really do appreciate all of you being here, watching this. Shout out to all my channel members supporting the channel. Really means a lot. There's so much more I would love to do for you guys. Wow, I'm so stacked with work. Still trying to figure out how to make money doing this, which I hate. I don't like. I would just rather be set. Also, dude, we just found out we have to leave where we're living in the next 90 days. Oh my gosh. Well, I've been hit with so much recently. It's intense. We've been here 8 years. They just sold the place that we're renting and they don't want to rent it anymore. Wow. We're in kind of a tough situation, guys. So I have a lot going on. So that said, it means a lot to me that you guys are here watching my streams. I'm trying to get on as much as I can. All right. Love you guys. We'll see you in the next one. All right. Good night.